Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Netheric Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. For more than a decade, I worked in corrections. By the end of my career, I had spent years dealing with inmates, hospitals, emergencies, deaths, and every kind of human tragedy you can imagine. Most of what people think is scary becomes routine after a while. You see enough violence, enough suffering, and enough death that very little surprises you anymore. My final assignment before leaving corrections was at a civilian hospital that had a secure section specifically for inmates. It was basically a prison unit inside a regular hospital. I worked the night shift there for about 5 years. In all that time, I only experienced 2 incidents that genuinely left me wondering if there was something more going on than what we could explain. I'm not a religious person. I consider myself an agnostic atheist. I don't believe in heaven, hell, demons, angels, or any of that. I've always tried to find rational explanations for strange events. But there are a couple of experiences that still make me pause. The first involved what staff eventually nicknamed the Kid. There was a particular room set up in the hospital that consisted of 2 rooms sharing a common wall. Nothing about the rooms looked unusual. If you walked through them during the day, you wouldn't notice anything strange. Yet over the years, stories started piling up. It began with inmates who were near death. When you've worked around dying people long enough, you start recognizing patterns. Some patients become confused. Some talk to family members who aren't there. Some relive old memories. None of that is especially unusual. But every now and then, someone would mention a child. Not a random child. The same child. An elderly inmate would suddenly start smiling and talking to someone we couldn't see. Sometimes they would call him by different names. Sometimes they would think he was their grandson. Sometimes they'd say things like, "You've gotten so big," or "I've missed you," or "You look just like your father." The conversation sounded incredibly real to them. What made it strange was that different inmates, years apart, would describe very similar experiences. There was always a boy, always around the same age, always appearing in those same rooms. One of the stranger stories came from a couple of coworkers who were covering overtime on my shift. They were dealing with an older inmate who became absolutely delighted because he thought his grandson had come to visit. The problem was that he also insisted his mother was waiting outside and wanted to come in. He became genuinely upset with staff because he thought they were preventing his family from visiting. The situation escalated enough that people remembered it long afterward. The thing is, it wasn't always dying inmates. Every now and then we'd get someone admitted because they were completely out of their mind on drugs. Meth, synthetic marijuana. K2, whatever happened to be popular at the time. Occasionally, those inmates would start talking about the Kid, too. Not often, but often enough. The stories became so common among prison staff that the Kid eventually got a nickname. Some people called him Johnny. Others just called him the Kid. Most of us assumed there was a simple explanation. Corrections officers are professional storytellers. One officer tells a new guy a creepy story. That guy tells another officer. Eventually, the story spreads. Before long, inmates hear something. They become suggestible. They start seeing what they've been told exists. That explanation made perfect sense to me. In fact, I believed it completely. Until one particular night. I was assigned to those rooms when an inmate was brought in after using K2. The guy couldn't have been older than his early 20s. Honestly, I don't even know if he was old enough to legally drink. By the time he arrived, he was completely detached from reality. Anyone who has worked around severe drug-induced psychosis knows what that looks like. The person isn't just intoxicated. They're gone, paranoid, agitated, hallucinating, living in an entirely different reality than everyone around them. The medical staff got him stabilized as best they could. Medication helped. Eventually, he quieted down and appeared to settle. For a while, things seemed under control. Then sometime around 3 or 4 in the morning, he woke up again. If you've worked night shift, you know exactly the kind of hour I'm talking about. The dead zone. The hour where everyone is exhausted and reality starts feeling slightly disconnected. The inmate became agitated almost immediately. He started ranting, then yelling, then screaming. At first it sounded like the usual psychosis-driven nonsense. Then I heard what he was actually saying. He was screaming about a kid. Not just mentioning a kid. Screaming about him. According to the inmate, the kid was running around the room, messing with him, keeping him awake, watching him. He repeatedly yelled things like, "Get that fucking kid out of here." The intensity of it got everyone's attention. What bothered me wasn't that a psychotic inmate was hallucinating. That's normal. What bothered me was that he described the exact same thing dozens of inmates before him had described. And as far as I knew, he couldn't possibly have heard those stories. He had come from a facility hours away. The stories weren't common knowledge throughout the prison system. Most hospital staff didn't even know about them. Only the officers who regularly worked those rooms had heard about the kid. Yet here he was, screaming about the same child, the same room, the same experience. I still think there's probably a rational explanation. Maybe there was something about those rooms. Maybe there was some subtle environmental factor. Maybe human psychology is stranger than we understand. But that night definitely made me question my assumptions. The second experience happened several years later, and honestly, it bothered me far more. We had an elderly inmate admitted who was actively dying. He was one of those inmates everyone knew. A repeat customer. The kind of person who spent so much time in hospitals that staff practically recognized him on sight. The difference was that this time he wasn't leaving. Anyone with enough experience around death can usually tell when someone is nearing the end. The signs become familiar. Breathing changes. Awareness changes. The body begins shutting down. This was that night. The old man had committed crimes that made him universally hated among staff. Even people who normally remain professional struggled to hide their disgust around him. He was a convicted child predator. The details of his crimes were horrific. Nobody felt sympathy for him. Nobody, by that point, he could barely move. He couldn't speak. He couldn't really communicate at all. Yet something about him was deeply unsettling. His eyes. That's what I remember most. His eyes were alive. Not blank, not unfocused, not drifting. Alive, they moved constantly, tracking something, watching something. He stared toward the ceiling over his bed as if there was something there, something only he could see. Every so often, he would let out a small sound, not a groan of pain, not a medical distress sound, a whimper. The kind of sound a frightened person makes. The room felt strange. 2 nurses and I stood there watching. Nobody said much. We were all thinking the same thing. What is he looking at? The man's eyes never left the ceiling. Whatever he saw terrified him. There was no doubt about that. I've seen fear. This was fear. Pure fear. Eventually, his breathing slowed, then stopped. And just like that, he was gone. The room fell silent. For a second, nobody moved. Then it happened. The sink turned on, by itself. Not a drip. not a faucet slowly leaking. The sink turned on. Water started running. Immediately, the timing couldn't have been worse. The old inmate dying had already created an incredibly uncomfortable atmosphere. The sudden sound of running water nearly made all of us jump. We all looked at each other. Nobody had touched it. Nobody was anywhere near it. There wasn't enough time for someone to sneak in. The sink had absolutely been off moments before, yet now water was pouring from the faucet. I still don't know what caused it. Maybe it was a mechanical issue. Maybe there was a plumbing problem. Maybe there is a perfectly normal explanation. But I'll admit something. Part of me doesn't really want one. Because as much as I don't believe in hell, there's a small part of me that likes imagining that maybe something had come for him. Not because I believe it happened. Because after reading his charges, the idea felt strangely satisfying. Do I think a supernatural force was waiting above his bed? No. Do I think demons dragged him away? No. But standing in that room, watching a terrified man stare at something none of us could see, and then hearing that sink suddenly roar to life the exact moment he died, I can't deny it felt like something out of a horror movie. After all these years, I still don't know what happened in either of those rooms. I still think most paranormal stories have perfectly ordinary explanations. People hallucinate. People become confused. People hear stories and unconsciously repeat them. The dying brain does remarkable things. But every now and then, an experience comes along that doesn't fit neatly into a box. And those are the ones that stay with you. Not because they prove anything, because they leave you wondering. And sometimes wondering is a lot harder to live with than knowing. The strangest thing that has ever happened to me wasn't seeing a ghost, winning the lottery, or surviving some life-threatening accident. It was realizing that I had been right about something nobody else believed. This happened just before COVID hit the United Kingdom. Today, everyone knows what COVID was and what it did to the world. Looking back, it's easy to forget that there was a time when almost nobody took it seriously. There was a period when it was just a few reports coming out of another country, a handful of stories that most people dismissed as distant problems that would never affect their own lives. For me, that period was one of the most isolating experiences I have ever lived through. At the time, I worked in health and safety. It wasn't a job I particularly loved, but it came with responsibilities that occasionally required looking at risks before everyone else noticed them. One day, I was given what seemed like a simple task. Our company had an office in China, and I was asked to source protective masks for employees there. At first, I assumed it would be easy. Masks weren't exactly rare items. Countless suppliers sold them, and ordering large quantities was usually straightforward. But when I started making calls and sending emails, something immediately felt wrong. Every supplier I contacted was sold out. Not some suppliers, not most suppliers, every supplier. It didn't matter where they were located. It didn't matter whether they were local manufacturers or international distributors. Everywhere I looked, inventory had disappeared. The response was always the same: sold out, no stock available, no estimated delivery date. Try again later. At first, I thought it was strange. Then I thought it was concerning. Then I became genuinely worried. I started digging deeper. What exactly was happening in China that was causing the entire global supply chain for masks to collapse? The more research I did, the more uncomfortable I became. Every evening after work, I found myself reading article after article, following discussions online, translating reports, and trying to piece together what was really happening. The information was confusing at first. Official reports seemed calm. Unofficial reports were anything but. I started seeing videos from doctors and medical workers in China who were desperately trying to raise awareness about a new outbreak. Some of them appeared genuinely terrified. Many were warning that the situation was far worse than governments were publicly admitting. Then, something even stranger happened. Some of those doctors disappeared. One day they were posting updates online. The next day their accounts went silent. News reports about whistleblowers started appearing. Stories emerged about people being questioned, silenced, or pressured for speaking publicly. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just another localized health issue. Something serious was unfolding. I couldn't yet predict exactly how serious. In truth, my imagination wasn't nearly dramatic enough to anticipate what would eventually happen. But I knew enough to understand that ignoring the situation would be a mistake. So I started talking about it. That turned out to be a bigger mistake than I expected. Nobody believed me. Not one person. At first, people listened politely. Then they started laughing. I would bring up the shortage of protective equipment and explain why it worried me. People would shrug. I would explain that hospitals could become overwhelmed if the disease spread internationally. People would change the subject. I would point to reports from China and discuss how quickly the outbreak seemed to be growing. People would roll their eyes. The reaction was almost always the same. They thought I was overreacting. Meetings became frustrating experiences. Whenever I tried raising concerns, people treated the topic as a joke. Some colleagues openly laughed. Others made comments about me spending too much time reading things online. The more evidence I found, the more determined I became. Unfortunately, the more determined I became, the stranger I appeared to everyone around me. Even my therapist became concerned. When I explained what I thought might happen, they questioned whether my anxiety was causing me to catastrophize. Looking back, I don't blame them. At the time, my predictions sounded extreme. The problem was that reality eventually became far worse than anything I had predicted. The situation reached a new level about a week before everything changed. My mother attended church regularly. Like many churches, communion was a normal part of the service. The congregation included many elderly members. Many had existing health conditions. By that point, I had spent months studying everything I could find about the outbreak. I had become convinced that if this disease reached the UK, communal practices involving close contact could become dangerous. I reached out to my mother's priest. I explained my concerns as calmly as possible. I told him that he should consider temporarily stopping communion. I wasn't trying to create panic. I wasn't claiming the world was ending. I was simply looking at the risks. If one infected person stood at the front of the line, the consequences could be devastating. Many of the people attending services were elderly. Many were vulnerable. I felt someone needed to think about protecting them. The priest listened politely. Then he contacted my mother. Not because he agreed with me, because he was worried about my mental health. That conversation was one of the lowest moments of the entire experience. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I wasn't trying to seek attention. I genuinely believed I was helping. Instead, people increasingly viewed me as someone losing touch with reality. My family became worried. Friends became concerned. The more I spoke about COVID, the more people questioned my judgment. Meanwhile, I continued preparing. I stopped shaking hands at work. People noticed immediately. Some found it funny. Others thought it was rude. I began carrying alcohol hand sanitizer everywhere. I cleaned surfaces. I kept reminding colleagues that they should be paying attention to what was happening overseas. Nobody listened, at least not seriously. I also stocked up on food. Nothing extreme. I wasn't building a bunker or filling a basement with supplies. I simply bought enough food to get through a couple of weeks. if things became difficult. Even that was enough to make people think I had lost my mind. Family members questioned my behavior. Friends joked about me becoming a survivalist. At one point, several people essentially staged an intervention. They sat me down and tried convincing me to stop. They told me I was becoming obsessed. They said I was frightening people. They assured me everything would be fine. One person actually told me I was acting like a madman. I remember leaving that conversation feeling completely defeated. For a brief moment, I wondered if they were right. What if I had become consumed by fear? What if I had misread the situation entirely? What if months of research had simply made me paranoid? It's difficult to maintain confidence when every person around you thinks you're wrong. Eventually, even you start questioning yourself. Then, everything changed. Almost overnight, the headlines exploded. Emergency announcements appeared. Governments started implementing restrictions. Businesses shut down. Travel stopped. News coverage became relentless. Suddenly, every conversation was about COVID. The disease that nobody had cared about became the only thing anyone talked about. The warnings that had been mocked were now being repeated on national television. The precautions that had seemed ridiculous suddenly became normal. Hand sanitizer appeared everywhere. People stopped shaking hands. Masks became essential. Social distancing became part of daily life. The world transformed with shocking speed. I wish I could say I felt triumphant. I didn't. Mostly, I felt numb. There was no satisfaction in being right. The reality unfolding around us was too serious for that. Still, there was a strange feeling that accompanied those first weeks. A feeling I struggle to describe even now. For months, I had felt isolated. For months, people had treated me as though I was detached from reality. Then, suddenly, reality arrived, and it looked remarkably similar to the thing I had been warning people about. The most surreal moment came shortly after lockdown began. Like many people, I was spending most of my time indoors. The streets were empty. The world felt frozen. One evening, I decided to take a walk to the local petrol station just to stretch my legs. It was late. The roads were unusually quiet. There were almost no cars, almost no people. The silence felt unnatural. Then I saw them. A herd of deer standing calmly in the middle of the road. For a moment, I simply stopped walking. The sight looked unreal. This was normally a busy area. Traffic should have been passing through. People should have been out and about. Instead, wildlife had begun reclaiming spaces usually dominated by humans. The deer stood there peacefully, completely undisturbed. The image has stayed with me ever since. Not because of the animals themselves, but because of what the moment represented. Standing there, looking at those deer in the middle of an empty road, I realized that everything had actually happened. The thing I had spent months worrying about, the thing people had mocked, the thing that had caused friends, family, coworkers, and even professionals to question my judgment. It was real. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. For years before that, I had carried a quiet belief that I wasn't particularly intelligent. I often assumed other people knew more than I did. I assumed they understood things better. I assumed my opinions mattered less. That experience forced me to reconsider those beliefs. Not because I was some genius, not because I possessed special knowledge, but because I had trusted my own judgment when everyone else dismissed it. I had followed evidence instead of popularity. I had paid attention when others weren't looking. And for the first time in my life, I realized that my perspective had value. Over the months that followed, some people apologized. A few coworkers admitted they should have listened. Some friends acknowledged they had underestimated the situation. Several family members quietly changed their opinions. Those conversations meant more to me than they probably realized. But not everyone apologized. Some people never mentioned it again. Some acted as though the previous months had never happened. Others simply avoided the topic entirely. I eventually understood why. Being wrong isn't always difficult. Admitting you're wrong can be, especially when someone you dismissed turns out to be correct. To this day, I don't think about COVID as the time I predicted a pandemic. I think about it as the moment I learned to trust myself. The pandemic changed the world in countless ways. For me personally, one of the biggest changes happened internally. It taught me that being laughed at doesn't automatically mean you're wrong. It taught me that evidence matters more than public opinion. And most importantly, it taught me that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is believing in your own judgment, when absolutely nobody else does. That lesson stayed with me long after the lockdowns ended, long after the masks disappeared, and long after the world began moving forward again. I lived in my childhood home for nearly 20 years before finally moving out. It was the kind of place that becomes part of who you are. Every room held memories. Every creaking floorboard was familiar. Every strange little noise the house made had been heard so many times that I barely noticed them anymore. The house itself wasn't particularly old, but it had its own personality. Whenever the wind picked up, it would groan softly. The wooden stairs sometimes creaked when nobody was on them. Pipes would occasionally make strange knocking sounds in the winter. Like most people who spend years in the same house, I learned to ignore all of it. After a while, those sounds simply became part of the background. Because of that, I've always been skeptical when people tell stories about hearing something unusual in their homes. Houses make noises. Walls settle. Wind moves through vents. There is usually a logical explanation. At least, that's what I believed. Then something happened that I still can't explain. The first incident occurred when I was still living with my parents. It was a completely ordinary night. My parents had gone to bed hours earlier. The house was quiet, and everyone was asleep except me. I had stayed up later than usual and eventually decided to head downstairs to grab something to eat before going to bed myself. I remember the house feeling especially still that night. The television was off. No music was playing. There were no cars passing outside. Everything felt calm and silent. I made my way toward the kitchen, half awake and mostly thinking about what snack I wanted. Then I heard it. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was hearing. The sound seemed distant, soft, muffled. I stopped walking and listened. There it was again. It sounded like a woman crying. Not loud sobbing, not screaming, just quiet, muffled crying. The sound appeared to be coming from the second-story living room area. Immediately, I assumed it was my mother. The thought didn't seem unusual. Maybe she couldn't sleep. Maybe something had upset her. Maybe she was watching television and had become emotional over something. Without thinking much about it, I called out, "Mom, are you okay?" My voice echoed through the quiet house. The crying stopped. Silence. I waited for an answer. "Nothing," I called out again. Still nothing. For a moment, I stood there listening carefully. The entire house seemed frozen. Not a single sound. A strange feeling started creeping into my stomach. It wasn't fear exactly, more confusion than anything else. If it wasn't my mother, then who had I heard? Trying to be rational, I headed upstairs toward my parents' bedroom. The hallway was dark and quiet. I opened the bedroom door slowly. Both of my parents were asleep. Not just lying in bed, actually asleep. My father was snoring softly, and my mother appeared completely undisturbed. Neither looked like they had recently been awake. Neither appeared upset. Neither showed any sign that they had been crying. I stood there for several seconds trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Eventually, I convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the sound came from outside. Maybe it was the television in another room. Maybe I had misheard something entirely. After all, it was late. People hear strange things when they're tired. I shrugged it off and continued with my evening. Within a few days, I barely thought about it anymore. Life went on. Months passed. Then, years. The strange crying sound slowly faded into the background of my memory. Every once in a while, I would remember it, but never for long. There was nothing else unusual about the house. No ghost stories, no unexplained events, no strange sightings. Nothing. I continued living there for years without hearing that sound again. As time passed, I became even more convinced that it had simply been my imagination. Then came the second incident, and that's what makes the entire experience so difficult for me to explain. Several years had gone by. My parents were away for a few days, leaving me alone in the house. I don't remember exactly where they had gone, only that I had the place entirely to myself. It was nighttime when I returned home. The neighborhood was quiet. Most of the houses nearby had their lights off. I parked outside, walked up to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. Everything seemed completely normal. The house was dark, silent, empty. I reached for the light switch. Then I heard it. The crying. The exact same crying. The moment the sound reached my ears, something happened that I still struggle to describe. My body froze. Completely. One foot had barely crossed the threshold when every muscle in my body locked in place. It wasn't a conscious decision. I didn't stop because I wanted to. I stopped because some instinct deep inside me reacted before my mind could process what was happening. For a split second, it felt like my entire nervous system recognized the sound. The reaction was immediate. The crying was identical. Same muffled quality, same distant tone, same feeling. Even after all those years, I somehow knew instantly that it was the exact sound I had heard before. That realization terrified me. Not because the crying itself was particularly frightening. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it wasn't threatening. What frightened me was the certainty. The absolute certainty. Years had passed since the first incident. I had barely thought about it. Yet the second I heard that sound again, my body recognized it, before my conscious mind even caught up. The feeling was overwhelming. I stood frozen in the doorway listening. The crying continued for only a few seconds. Then it stopped. The silence that followed felt even worse. The house suddenly seemed different. Not dangerous. Not haunted. Just wrong. Like something was out of place. I remember staring into the darkness of the hallway and feeling an intense urge to leave, to simply back out the door and drive away, which made no sense. This was my home. I had lived there for nearly 2 decades. I knew every room, every hallway, every corner. There should have been nothing to fear. Yet standing there, I felt genuinely unsettled. After a few moments, I finally forced myself to move. I turned on lights throughout the house. I checked every room, the upstairs living room, the bedrooms, the bathroom. Everywhere, nothing, no television, no radio, no open windows, no source for the sound. The house was completely empty. I walked through every room trying to recreate what I had heard. I listened for plumbing noises. I checked outside for neighbors. I even stood quietly for several minutes, hoping the sound would happen again. It never did. Eventually, I settled down and convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. But unlike the first incident, I couldn't completely dismiss it. The problem was my reaction. That was what bothered me most. If it had been a random sound, why had my body reacted so strongly? Why had I recognized it immediately? Why had I frozen before I even consciously remembered the first occurrence? The experience stayed with me long after that night. Years later, I still think about it occasionally. Not because I believe the house was haunted. Honestly, I still don't know what I believe. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe some unique combination of wind, pipes, and acoustics created a sound that resembled a crying woman. Maybe I heard something from outside both times. Maybe my memory connected the two experiences and amplified the fear. All of those possibilities are reasonable, yet none of them fully explain the feeling I had. What sticks with me isn't the sound itself. It's the way my body reacted. The instant recognition, the immediate fear, the overwhelming certainty that I had heard that exact cry before. I've lived in other homes since then. I've heard strange noises. I've experienced moments where a sound in the middle of the night made me stop and listen. But nothing has ever felt quite like that. Nothing has ever triggered that same reaction. Nothing has ever made me freeze in place the way that sound did. And that's why the memory has stayed with me for so many years. Not because I think I encountered something supernatural. Not because I have some dramatic ghost story to tell. But because in 20 years of living in that house, I heard that mysterious crying only twice, years apart. Both times at night. Both times completely unexplained. And both times it left me with the same feeling that something wasn't quite right. To this day, I still have no idea what caused it. All I know is that somewhere in the quiet of that house, on two separate nights, years apart, I heard what sounded like a woman crying. And for reasons I still can't explain, it frightened me more than anything else ever has. I didn't actually see anything. Honestly, if I had seen something, I might have been able to convince myself it was my imagination. A trick of the light, a shadow, a tree stump that looked weird in the dark. What bothers me is that I heard it. And to this day, I still don't know what made that sound. This happened about 6 months ago, give or take. I live in British Columbia, Canada, in a heavily wooded area near a popular lake. The strange thing is that we're not exactly out in the middle of nowhere. The edge of town is only about 5 minutes away. During the day, everything feels completely normal. People drive by, boats head to the lake, and families hike the nearby trails. At night, though, the entire area feels different. Once the sun goes down, the forest seems to swallow everything. Our property backs up against a mountainside, and our backyard is roughly an acre before it starts blending into thicker woods. We have neighbors behind us who run a small homestead. They've got cows, goats, and enough animals to make you wonder how they keep track of them all. Their property borders ours, separated mostly by a patchwork fence that looks like it has been repaired 100 different times by 100 different people. Some sections are wire mesh. Other sections are old lumber nailed together at odd angles. Parts of it lean so badly that it barely qualifies as a fence anymore. The people are great. Their dogs are another story. They have 5 of them, 3 black labs and 2 massive Great Pyrenees. Those dogs take their jobs seriously. If a squirrel sneezes 3 properties away, they know about it. If a deer walks through the woods, they know about it. If the wind blows differently than usual, they're probably barking at that too. So hearing them make noise isn't unusual. On this particular night, I took my dog Ryder outside for a quick walk before bed. It was late, really late, probably 1 or 2 in the morning, I don't remember exactly. The world had that strange stillness that only exists in the middle of the night. No cars, no voices, no distant sounds from town, just darkness and forest Our driveway eventually turns into a dirt path that loops around the backyard and winds through the trees. Part of it runs alongside the neighbor's property line. Ryder and I had walked this route countless times. He was a rough collie, basically a real-life lassie dog, smart enough to make you question whether he secretly understood English better than most people. Over the years, we developed a little training exercise together. I called it Listen. Whenever I gave the command, Ryder would stop what he was doing, sit down, and focus. Not on me, on the environment. Instead of paying attention to loud, obvious sounds, he'd try picking out quieter details. Birds moving through branches, leaves rustling, the wind shifting direction, small animals moving through the brush. It had become one of our favorite things to do together. Most people thought it sounded ridiculous. But it worked. He genuinely seemed to enjoy it. That night, we stopped near the fence line and settled down. I crouched beside him. The woods were dark, the air was cool, everything felt peaceful. Then the neighbors' dogs started losing their minds. At first, I ignored it. Like I said, they barked at everything. But after a minute, I realized this was different. The barking wasn't random. It wasn't warning barks. It wasn't excitement. It sounded focused, directed like they could actually see something. The volume kept increasing. The intensity kept building. I glanced toward their property, but couldn't see much through the darkness. The dogs were on the far side of their land, probably close to an acre away. Whatever they were barking at was somewhere over there. Ryder remained calm. I told him, listen. He sat, ears forward, completely focused. The barking continued. Then I heard something. A branch snapped. Not at ground level. Higher, much higher, somewhere up in the trees. The sound was sharp enough that it immediately caught my attention. A second later, the dogs exploded. Their barking intensified dramatically, and they started moving. Fast, you could hear it in the sound. The direction changed. The barking got louder. Closer, whatever had their attention was now heading toward our side of the property. Or they were chasing it. Either way, something was happening. Ryder stayed seated. I stayed crouched beside him. Neither of us moved. The barking kept getting closer. The dogs were covering ground quickly. At this point, even I was paying close attention. There was something different about the way they were reacting. This wasn't normal dog behavior. It felt more urgent, more serious. The branch snapping replayed in my mind. Then another thought occurred to me. Whatever had made that sound wasn't reacting to us. We had been completely silent. I wasn't walking. Ryder wasn't moving. We were both sitting still. The dogs weren't responding to us. They were responding to something else. Something moving through the darkness. The barking became deafening. The dogs were now near the fence line, close enough that I could hear individual barks instead of just a wall of noise. Ryder finally shifted slightly. I could feel him wanting to move. I reached over and quietly told him, shh. He settled again. The dogs kept barking. Shh, listen. The woods beyond the fence seemed impossibly dark. The kind of darkness where your eyes convince you they're seeing shapes that aren't really there. The dogs were now practically opposite us, going completely insane. Again, I whispered, shh, listen, and then something answered me. Not Ryder, not the dogs, something else. From the darkness, on our side of the fence. Maybe 20 feet away, possibly less. Right between us and the barking dogs, a sound came back. Shh. For a split second, my brain couldn't process it. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It sounded like my own whisper, like someone mimicking me. Except it wasn't human. At least it didn't sound human. There was a strange texture to it, almost throaty. Not a hiss, not a growl, not a voice, something in between. Like whatever made the sound didn't quite understand how to make it properly. The moment it happened, every muscle in my body locked up. I froze completely. The dogs kept barking. The forest remained dark. The sound echoed in my head. Shh. My mind immediately began searching for explanations. A bird? No. An animal? Maybe. But what animal responds to a whispered command with what sounds like a whispered imitation? And why from 20 feet away? On my side of the fence? I stared into the darkness, trying to see something. Anything. My heart was hammering. Every instinct in my body suddenly screamed that we needed to leave. Now, not in 5 minutes. Not after investigating. Now, the strange thing is that the fear wasn't dramatic. It wasn't panic. It was certainty. The same kind of certainty you feel when your hand touches a hot stove. You don't debate it. You don't analyze it. You just know. Leave, I turned to Ryder. I was about to say, go, let's go. Only Ryder had already made his decision. That absolute traitor was gone. Completely gone. I don't know exactly when he moved. I don't know how he moved so quietly. But while I was frozen, staring into the woods, Ryder had apparently decided that whatever was out there was entirely my problem. I looked toward the house, and there he was, standing on the back deck of our trailer, waiting, watching, safe, a considerable distance away from me. The dog didn't need a command, didn't need encouragement, didn't need convincing. He had already evaluated the situation and chosen self-preservation. The realization somehow made everything 10 times worse. Because Ryder wasn't a nervous dog. He wasn't skittish. He wasn't the type to run away from random noises, yet somehow he'd silently abandoned the mission and relocated to safety without consulting me. I remember looking back toward the darkness one final time. The dogs were still barking. The woods were still black. Whatever had made that sound remained invisible, and that was enough for me. I ran, not jogged, not power walked. Ran. The distance from where I stood to that deck was probably the fastest I have ever moved in my life. Every horror movie decision I'd ever criticized disappeared instantly. I wasn't curious. I didn't want answers. I didn't want evidence. I wanted a locked door between me and whatever had whispered back. The moment I reached the trailer, Ryder gave me a look that seemed suspiciously close to what took you so long. To this day, I don't know what was out there. Maybe there is a perfectly logical explanation. Maybe some animal made a sound at exactly the wrong moment. Maybe exhaustion caused my brain to interpret it as something else. Maybe. But I know what I heard. And what bothers me most isn't the sound itself. It's the timing. The fact that it responded. The fact that it happened immediately after I whispered into the darkness. And the fact that my supposedly loyal dog decided that whatever was standing out there was important enough to leave me behind. I've heard strange things in the woods before. Coyotes, owls, foxes, animals make sounds that can be downright terrifying at night. But I've never heard anything like that before. And I haven't heard it since. Honestly, I hope I never do again. One of the creepiest experiences of my life happened when I was living in my mom's old house. Even now, years later, I still don't have an explanation for it. The house itself wasn't particularly scary. It was an older home, but nothing about it stood out as unusual when we first moved in. Like most families, we were focused on unpacking, settling in, and figuring out where everything belonged. My bedroom ended up being in the attic. Technically, it wasn't a full attic. Part of it had been finished and converted into a living space, while roughly a quarter of it remained unfinished. The finished section became my room, while the unfinished section sat behind a separate door. That door always bothered me. I couldn't really explain why. From the day we moved in, it gave me an uncomfortable feeling. The unfinished area wasn't something anyone used. It contained exposed beams, insulation, and sections of flooring that weren't safe to walk on. There were gaps where someone could potentially fall through if they weren't paying attention. Because of that, the door leading into that section had a lock installed near the top. The lock wasn't there for security. It was there because we had cats. My mom didn't want them wandering inside, getting trapped, eating insulation, or accidentally falling through unfinished sections of the floor. The lock sat high enough that I couldn't reach it. Only my mom and stepdad could comfortably unlock it. As a result, the door remained closed at all times. Nobody ever went in there. Nobody ever had a reason to. The attic itself had another feature that always made it feel strange at night. The staircase leading up to my room sat directly in front of an enormous window. The window stretched almost the entire height of the wall. During the daytime, it let in plenty of sunlight. At night, it became something else entirely. The glass reflected shadows from outside, streetlights, moving branches, and whatever else happened to pass through the darkness. Walking up those stairs after sunset always felt unsettling. I never liked it. In fact, for the first several months after moving in, I avoided sleeping upstairs whenever possible. Most nights I would end up on the couch downstairs. Eventually, my mom got tired of finding me asleep in the living room every morning. She insisted that if I had a bedroom, I needed to use it. Reluctantly, I started sleeping upstairs more regularly. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then one night I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was dark and quiet. I rolled over and looked around. That's when I noticed it. The door to the unfinished attic was open. Not cracked. Not slightly ajar. Open, I immediately sat up. My stomach dropped. The lock was located near the top of the door. I couldn't reach it. There was no way I could have accidentally opened it. Nobody in the house ever used that room. Yet somehow the door stood open in the darkness. For several moments, I simply stared at it. The black opening looked far darker than the rest of the room. Eventually, I got out of bed and walked over. I didn't go inside. There was no chance of that. I simply pushed the door closed. Since I couldn't reach the lock, I grabbed a brick that had been sitting nearby and wedged it against the bottom of the door. Then I went back to bed. The next morning, I told my mom what had happened. She wasn't overly concerned. Her first assumption was that the wind had rattled the door somehow. Maybe the lock hadn't fully caught. Maybe vibrations had loosened it. She relocked it and added 2 more bricks against the door just to be safe. She also mentioned getting another lock installed later. At the time, her explanation seemed reasonable. The door stayed closed. Life continued. Then, about a week later, something happened that changed everything. My mom and I had been out running errands. When we returned home, I headed inside and started walking toward the attic stairs. Halfway up, I stopped. The door was open again, wide open. The bricks had been shoved aside. One sat several feet away. Another had fallen over near the wall. But that wasn't the worst part. The lock itself had been ripped off, not unlocked, not loosened, torn completely off the wall. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then, panic set in. Someone had broken into the house. At least that was the only explanation we could think of. We immediately called the police. Officers arrived and conducted a thorough search. They checked every room, every door, every window, the unfinished attic, the roof access. Everything, what they found, made no sense. There were no signs of forced entry, no damaged doors, no broken windows, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had entered the house. Our neighbors had security cameras covering parts of the street. The footage showed nothing unusual. Nobody approaching the home. Nobody leaving. Nothing, the officers couldn't explain it. Eventually they left, believing there wasn't enough evidence to suggest a break-in had occurred. That answer didn't make any of us feel better. If someone hadn't entered the house, then how had the door opened? And how had the lock been ripped from the wall? After that, my mom stopped taking chances. The damaged lock was replaced. Then, another was added. We installed a heavy latch lock. We installed a chain lock. Several nails were driven into parts of the frame to reinforce the door. The goal was simple. Make absolutely certain the door could not open. At the same time, I moved downstairs again. My mom was concerned enough that she no longer wanted me sleeping in the attic alone. We even added another lock to the screen door leading upstairs. The entire setup started looking less like a bedroom and more like a secure storage facility. For a while, the extra precautions seemed to work. Weeks passed. Then months. Nothing happened. Gradually, everyone relaxed. The fear started fading. Until one night. It was around 10 o'clock. I was getting ready for bed and remembered I had left an extra blanket upstairs. The attic window faced a nearby street lamp, so even at night the room usually had enough ambient light to see without turning on a lamp. I walked upstairs without much thought, opened the screen door, started climbing the stairs, and stepped onto the first step leading into the attic. That's when I looked up. The door stood open. Again, every lock, every barrier, every precaution. Open, but this time something else was there. Someone standing inside. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The figure was nearly touching the ceiling. Its head sat only inches below it. The shape appeared impossibly tall. Most of the body looked completely dark. Not shadowy, dark, as if light simply didn't reflect from it. Only parts of the legs and one hand appeared partially transparent. I remember seeing enough detail to make out clothing. A long-sleeved shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Pants, a belt. Messy hair. But there was no face. At least none that I could see. Where the face should have been, there was only darkness. The figure wasn't moving. It simply stood there. Watching, for what felt like an eternity, I froze. In reality, it was probably only a few seconds. Maybe less. Then survival instinct finally took over. I turned and ran downstairs. I nearly fell trying to get down the steps. When I reached the living room, I was barely able to get the words out. My mom immediately knew something was wrong. The moment I explained what I'd seen, she called the police. Again, officers arrived within minutes. Again, they searched everything. Again, they found nothing. No person. No intruder. No evidence. No footprints. No damaged windows. No unlocked entrances. No sign that anyone had entered or left the home. The attic was empty. Completely empty. The only physical evidence they found involved the locks. The latch lock had somehow been opened. The chain lock had been broken, not removed. Broken, several links in the middle of the chain had snapped apart. The officers were visibly disturbed by that. Chain locks don't normally fail in the center, especially not without significant force. Still, no explanation emerged. Nothing connected the broken chain to an actual intruder. The situation became serious enough that one officer remained stationed near the house for the rest of the night. For nearly a month afterward, patrol cars frequently drove through the neighborhood after dark. Yet nobody else reported anything unusual. No sightings, no attempted break-ins. Nothing. We were the only house experiencing it. The next day, my mom, stepdad, and I returned upstairs. The goal was to collect some of my belongings and install even more locks. None of us wanted to be there, but it had to be done. As my stepdad prepared to work on the door, he glanced toward the attic window. Then he froze. For several seconds, he simply stared. Finally, he walked over and pressed his hand against the glass. A handprint covered part of the window. Not outside. Inside, the print was enormous, larger than his hand, and my stepdad was the largest person in our family. When he placed his hand against it for comparison, the size matched almost perfectly around his fingers, while extending beyond them in several places. The print hadn't been there during the police investigation. We knew that because the officers had carefully inspected the area. More importantly, every officer who entered wore gloves. If they touched the window, they wouldn't have left a print. Yet there it was, clear as day, a massive handprint on the inside of the glass. Nobody could explain where it came from. Nobody could explain how it appeared, and nobody could explain why every lock on that door kept failing, despite increasingly impossible safeguards. To this day, I still don't know what I saw standing in that attic. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe there was an intruder somehow entering and leaving without leaving evidence. Maybe stress, darkness, and fear combined to create something that wasn't really there. I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. The locks were real. The broken chain was real. The torn-out hardware was real. The handprint was real. And the memory of standing on those stairs, staring at a figure almost tall enough to touch the ceiling, is something I have never been able to forget. About 6 years ago, when I was in college, a few roommates and I rented an old Victorian-style house near campus. Looking back, it was exactly the kind of place college students dream about when they're trying to save money. It was large, relatively cheap, close enough to walk to classes, and had just enough character to make us feel like we were living somewhere unique instead of another generic apartment complex. The house was old enough that every room seemed to have some strange feature. The floors creaked, the windows rattled when the wind picked up, the staircases groaned whenever someone walked on them. There were oddly shaped rooms, hidden corners, and little architectural details that probably seemed charming to the landlord, but mostly just confused us. At the time, we loved it. We were young, busy, and rarely home anyway. Between classes, part-time jobs, studying, and trying to maintain some kind of social life, the house mostly served as a place to sleep and store our stuff. One of the weirdest parts of the house was a hallway closet. At first glance, it looked completely normal. It sat near the center of the house beside the staircase and was much deeper than it needed to be. The closet stretched far beyond what seemed practical for storing coats or household supplies. We joked about it occasionally. Nobody ever questioned it seriously. Old houses have strange layouts. That was our explanation. Over time, the closet became a dumping ground. Winter coats, old backpacks, suitcases, storage bins, boxes we didn't want to unpack. Anything we didn't need immediately got shoved into the back of that closet. Months passed without anyone thinking twice about it. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. I was looking for a duffel bag. Nothing exciting. Just a regular day. I knew I had thrown the bag into the back of the closet weeks earlier, so I started digging through the pile of junk that had accumulated inside. The further back I went, the stranger the space felt. The closet seemed deeper than I remembered. I kept moving things aside, reaching farther into the darkness. Eventually, I found myself pressed against the rear wall. At least, what I thought was the rear wall. As I shifted a suitcase out of the way, my hand pressed against the wood, paneling behind it. Something moved. At first, I assumed the panel was damaged. The house had plenty of maintenance issues already. But when I pushed again, the panel shifted noticeably. I froze. The movement didn't feel accidental. It felt deliberate. Curious, I pushed harder. To my surprise, the entire section of wood slid sideways. Not much, just enough to reveal a narrow opening. For a second, I honestly thought I had discovered some kind of hidden storage compartment. Maybe an old section of the house that had been sealed off. Maybe a forgotten utility space. Maybe something interesting. I definitely wasn't expecting what I found. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam disappeared into darkness. Beyond the panel sat a small, unfinished crawl space hidden beneath the main staircase. The area wasn't visible from anywhere else in the house. Without moving the panel, you would never know it existed. The space was cramped, dusty, unfinished, the kind of place nobody would willingly spend time. At least that was my first thought. Then my flashlight moved across the floor, and I saw a sleeping bag. Not an old rolled-up sleeping bag tucked away in storage. An opened sleeping bag, positioned as if someone had been using it. My stomach tightened. I stepped closer. Nearby sat several empty energy drink cans. A few were crushed. Others were standing upright. The arrangement looked recent, far too recent. Then my flashlight landed on a paper plate, and everything changed. The plate contained several pizza crusts. At first glance, that might not sound unusual. College students leave food everywhere. But something about them immediately caught my attention. The cheese was still soft, greasy, fresh, not moldy, not dried out, not months old. Fresh, I remember staring at those pizza crusts for several seconds while my brain tried to process what I was looking at. There was only one conclusion that made sense. Someone had been living there. Not years ago. Not before we moved in. Recently, possibly currently. The realization hit me all at once. Somebody had been sleeping inside our house. Inside the walls. Behind a hidden panel. Just a few feet away from where we spent nearly every day. I backed away immediately. My heart was pounding. Every horror movie scenario I'd ever seen suddenly felt much less ridiculous. I called my roommates over. One by one, they looked inside. Each reaction was almost identical. Confusion, disbelief, then fear. We stood there trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The sleeping bag alone might have been explainable. Maybe it belonged to a previous tenant. Maybe someone stored it there years ago. But the food ruined that explanation. The energy drinks looked recent. The pizza looked recent. Everything looked recent. One roommate pointed out something that made the situation even worse. Whoever had been using the space had direct access to the house. They weren't trapped in there. They were entering and leaving somehow. And if they could do that, there was no way of knowing when they were there, or whether they were still there. The possibility that someone might be hiding somewhere else in the house suddenly became very real. We called the police immediately. To their credit, officers arrived fairly quickly. Unfortunately, that was where the helpful part ended. We explained everything. We showed them the hidden panel. We showed them the crawl space. We showed them the sleeping bag, the cans, and the food. The officers shined flashlights around for less than a minute. One stepped inside briefly. The other barely looked. Then they started offering explanations. Maybe it belonged to an old tenant. Maybe someone had forgotten it. Maybe it had been there for years. We pointed to the pizza. The cheese was still soft. The officers shrugged. We pointed out that the previous tenant had moved out months earlier. Again, they shrugged. We explained that nobody in the house knew the space existed until that afternoon. The officers remained unconvinced. Eventually, they left. No report. No investigation. No concern. Just a casual suggestion that it was probably nothing. The entire interaction left us feeling even worse. The people we expected to take the situation seriously clearly didn't. After the police left, we contacted family and friends. That went about as well. Almost everyone laughed. People thought it was funny. Some accused us of exaggerating. Others suggested one of the roommates was playing a prank. A few people seemed convinced we had staged the whole thing ourselves. Apparently, the idea of someone secretly living inside a house sounded too ridiculous to be real. But standing there looking at those fresh pizza crusts, it didn't feel ridiculous. It felt terrifying. The more we talked about it, the more disturbing the situation became. We started replaying months of memories, late-night conversations in the living room, movie nights, parties, arguments, personal discussions. Everything, that crawl space, sat only a few feet from where we spent most of our time. If someone had been staying there, they would have heard everything. Absolutely everything. They would have known our schedules, known when we left, known when we returned, known which bedrooms belonged to which people, known when the house was empty, known when everyone was asleep. The thought made my skin crawl. The idea that someone could have been silently listening from the other side of a hidden wall was somehow worse than the possibility of encountering them face to face, because we had no way of knowing how long it had been happening. Days? Weeks? Months? The uncertainty was unbearable. Within a week, we made a decision. We were leaving. The landlord wasn't happy. In fact, he was furious. He dismissed our concerns immediately. When we explained why we wanted out of the lease, he acted like we were being dramatic. Eventually, he threatened legal action if we refused to continue paying. Faced with the possibility of a lawsuit, we chose the least painful option available. We broke the lease, lost our security deposit, packed our belongings, and got out. At the time, it felt like the only reasonable decision. No amount of money was worth staying in a house where we no longer felt safe. Years have passed since then. Most of my college friends still think the entire thing is hilarious. Whenever old stories come up, someone inevitably mentions the closet incident. They laugh. They joke about us getting scared of a storage space. They treat it like one of those ridiculous college memories everyone eventually exaggerates. I usually laugh along with them. It's easier that way, but privately, the story still bothers me. Because I know what I saw. I know those pizza crusts weren't months old. I know that sleeping bag wasn't stored there by accident. And I know that hidden crawl space existed directly beside the room where we spent most of our time. Even now, 6 years later, one particular thought still makes me uncomfortable. I think about all those evenings when we'd sit on the couch, watching television. Relaxed, comfortable, completely unaware. Meanwhile, only a few feet away, behind a sliding panel hidden inside a closet, someone may have been sitting in the darkness. Listening, waiting, knowing we had absolutely no idea they were there. And honestly, that's the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. Not what we found, but wondering how long someone had been watching before we finally discovered the door. One of the strangest things I've ever experienced happened when I was 16 years old, and to this day I still can't fully explain it. I've spent years trying to come up with a logical explanation. I've replayed every detail in my head countless times. I've questioned my own memory more than once. But no matter how much time passes, one thing remains true. I know what I saw. Whether there was a reasonable explanation behind it or not is another matter entirely. At the time, I lived in a small farming community in the upper Midwest. When I say small, I mean the kind of town where everybody knows everybody. Families had lived there for generations. People knew who your parents were, who your grandparents were, where you lived, what vehicle you drove, and usually what you had for dinner the night before. Privacy wasn't exactly common. If someone got a new truck, half the town knew about it by the next morning. If a couple got into an argument in public, people would still be talking about it a week later. It was that kind of place. Because of that, serious secrets rarely stayed secret for very long. At least that was always my impression growing up. The incident happened sometime around the year 2000. I'd gone to a concert with some friends about an hour and a half away from town. For a 16-year-old, it felt like a huge adventure. We spent weeks looking forward to it. The concert ran late, and by the time everything ended and we started heading home, it was already well past midnight. Back then, driving alone at night didn't feel unusual, especially in rural areas. Most of the roads were empty after dark. You could drive for miles without seeing another vehicle. By the time I got close to home, it was nearly 2 in the morning. I remember feeling exhausted. My ears were still ringing slightly from the music. The adrenaline from the concert had worn off, leaving behind that strange mixture of fatigue and restlessness that comes after a long night. The final stretch of my drive took me down a gravel road that cut through farmland. I knew every inch of it. I'd driven it hundreds of times. On one side of the road was land my father farmed. On the other side was more farmland stretching into darkness. There were no streetlights, no houses close by, no businesses, just fields and open sky. At night, the area felt isolated in a way that's difficult to explain to people who haven't lived in rural communities. The darkness out there wasn't city darkness. It was complete darkness, the kind where your headlights become the only source of light for miles. I was less than a mile from home when it happened. I came around a gentle curve in the road. As my headlights swept across one of the fields, I noticed several small points of light in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. My brain automatically assumed they were reflectors. Farm equipment often had reflective markers attached to it. Fence posts sometimes reflected light, too. It was a completely normal sight. Then, something felt wrong. The lights weren't arranged like reflectors. They appeared scattered, uneven, moving slightly. A fraction of a second later, my brain caught up. Those weren't reflectors. They were flames. Tiny flames. Lighters. For one brief moment, I stared at them without understanding what I was looking at. Then, my headlights illuminated more of the field, and I saw the people holding them. There were roughly a dozen figures standing together. Maybe a few more, maybe a few less. I didn't stop to count. What I remember clearly is what they were wearing. Every one of them appeared to be dressed in long white robes, and every one of them appeared to be wearing pointed white hoods, the kind that immediately triggers recognition. Even from a distance, even in poor lighting, my stomach dropped instantly. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. The image felt so out of place that it seemed impossible. It didn't belong there, not in that field, not in my town, not on an ordinary night. Then, my headlights hit them directly. What happened next remains one of the strangest parts of the entire experience. The moment the light reached them, the group reacted. Not by running, not by scattering, not by turning around. They dropped, all at once. Every single figure seemed to hit the ground almost simultaneously. 1 second, they were standing. The next, they were gone. The field appeared empty. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my hands hurt. Every hair on my body stood up. My heart felt like it had jumped into my throat. The logical part of my brain wanted to slow down and look again. The survival part of my brain wanted absolutely nothing to do with that idea. I kept driving. Fast. Very fast. I don't remember much about the final stretch of road leading home. I only remember feeling terrified. Not because anyone had threatened me, not because anything chased me, but because what I had seen felt completely surreal. By the time I reached our driveway, I was shaking, actually shaking. My hands trembled so badly that I struggled to turn off the ignition. I rushed inside. My parents were asleep. I woke them up immediately. Neither of them were particularly happy about being dragged out of bed at 2 in the morning. I started explaining what I'd seen. A group of people, white robes, pointed hoods, lighters in a field, dropping to the ground when my headlights hit them. I expected concern, maybe confusion, maybe disbelief. What I got was something closer to suspicion. My parents looked at each other, then looked at me, then started asking questions. Had I been drinking? Was I sure I wasn't tired? Had someone offered me anything at the concert? Was it possible I'd imagined it? The more I insisted, the less convinced they seemed. By the end of the conversation, they had basically concluded that exhaustion or some kind of misunderstanding was the most likely explanation. In other words, they didn't believe me. Not really. And honestly, I understood why. The story sounded ridiculous. If someone else had told me the same thing, I probably would have questioned it too. The problem was that I had actually seen it. That image wasn't vague in my memory. It wasn't dreamlike. It wasn't fuzzy. I can still picture it now. The dark field, the flames, the robes, the way the figures suddenly disappeared when the headlights reached them. The memory feels as vivid today as it did that night. Over the years, I've considered countless explanations. Maybe it was some kind of prank. Maybe a group of bored teenagers decided to dress up and scare people driving by. The year 2000 wasn't exactly free of dumb behavior. Rural communities produced their fair share of people looking for entertainment in unusual ways. A bunch of local troublemakers playing dress-up isn't impossible. In fact, it's probably one of the more reasonable explanations. The problem is that even that theory raises questions. Who were they? How did nobody hear about it? In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, you'd think someone eventually would have talked. Somebody would have bragged. Somebody would have told a friend. Somebody would have let something slip. Yet I never heard a single rumor. Not then. Not later. Nothing. Another possibility is that my tired brain misinterpreted what I was seeing. Human perception isn't perfect, especially at night. Headlights create strange shadows. Distance distorts details. The mind fills in gaps. I know all of that. I've considered it repeatedly. But every time I revisit the memory, I arrive at the same conclusion. I wasn't imagining the people. There were definitely people standing in that field. The question is who they were and why they were there. That's the part I'll probably never know. What bothers me most isn't even the image itself anymore. It's the mystery, the complete lack of answers. The fact that something so bizarre happened less than a mile from my home, and yet I never learned anything more about it. No explanation, no confession, no local rumors, nothing, just a memory. A strange moment frozen in time. Sometimes when old friends start sharing creepy stories, the topic comes up. People usually laugh. Some think it was teenagers playing a prank. Others think I misidentified what I saw. A few insist it must have been some harmless gathering viewed from the wrong angle. Maybe they're right. Maybe one of those explanations is correct. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that on a quiet gravel road in the middle of farm country, less than a mile from home, I came around a curve and saw roughly a dozen figures standing in a field holding flames. They appeared to be dressed in white robes and pointed hoods, and the instant my headlights found them, they vanished into the darkness. More than 20 years later, I still remember every second of it, and I suspect I always will. One of the most terrifying experiences of my life happened when I was 14 years old, and even after more than 20 years, I still think about it. Not because something happened directly to me, not because I was injured, not because I was physically attacked. What haunts me is that I witnessed something terrible, and to this day I have no idea what happened to the woman involved. I hope she's okay. I really do. But I honestly don't know. Back then, there was a local club that occasionally hosted all-ages nights. Teenagers could get in, listen to music, dance, hang out with friends, and feel grown up for a few hours. For us, it was a big deal. We spent days planning who was going, what we were wearing, and where everyone would meet afterward. That particular night had been fun. Nothing unusual happened. I spent the evening with friends, laughing, talking, and enjoying the freedom that feels so exciting when you're 14 years old. Eventually, the event ended, and everyone started heading home. One by one, my friends split off in different directions. I lived the farthest away, so I ended up walking alone for the final stretch. At the time, that didn't seem particularly unusual. I knew the neighborhood well. I'd grown up there. The route home was simple. It was only about a 10-minute walk from the last friend's house to mine, maybe even less if I walked quickly. The weather started turning bad just as I left. At first, it was a light drizzle. Then the rain intensified. Within minutes, it was pouring. The streets became slick and reflective under the streetlights. Water ran along the curbs. The entire neighborhood took on that strange appearance that only exists during late-night storms. Everything felt emptier than usual. Quieter, the rain drowned out distant sounds and made the world seem smaller somehow. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept walking. The route took me past my old elementary school. I had graduated from there not long before. Seeing it always felt comforting because it reminded me that I was close to home. I knew every street around that area, every shortcut, every intersection. Nothing about the walk felt dangerous. I remember thinking only about getting inside and drying off. Then I heard a scream. A real scream. Not someone shouting. Not friends messing around. A scream filled with panic. The kind that immediately makes every muscle in your body tense. I stopped walking and looked up. The sound had come from somewhere ahead of me. For a second, I couldn't see anything. Then, movement exploded out of the darkness. A woman came running from the direction of a low-rise apartment building. One moment, she was hidden by shadows. The next, she was sprinting across a lawn. Even after all these years, I can still picture her. She was tall, blonde, thin to the point of looking almost gaunt. Her hair was wild from the rain. She looked terrified. She wasn't casually running. She was fleeing. There was no doubt about that. A split second later, a man came charging after her. He was tall, too. Lanky, fast, the distance between them disappeared almost immediately. I remember thinking that maybe she would get away. Maybe she'd make it to the street. Maybe she'd reach another building. Maybe someone would come outside. Instead, he caught her. Without slowing down, he slammed into her and threw her to the ground. The force of it shocked me. 1 second she was running. The next she was lying on the lawn. I froze. Completely froze. I know people often wonder how they would react in an emergency. They imagine themselves calling for help immediately, running to someone's aid, doing something heroic. The truth is that sometimes your body simply stops. That's what happened to me. I was 14, alone, standing in the rain, watching something I couldn't fully process. My brain seemed unable to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. The man started kicking her, again and again. She raised her arms to protect herself. I could hear her trying to yell, trying to tell him to stop, trying to get away. But he kept hitting her. Every instinct told me this was real. This wasn't an argument. This wasn't a fight between equals. This was someone being attacked. I wanted to move. I wanted to do something. But I couldn't. The entire scene unfolded incredibly fast. Maybe 10 seconds. Maybe less. Yet it felt much longer. The rain continued pouring. The woman struggled on the ground. The man continued attacking her. And I stood there frozen in the middle of the road. Then everything got worse. The man noticed me. I don't know exactly what gave me away. Maybe the streetlight caught me. Maybe I moved. Maybe I was simply impossible to miss standing there staring. Whatever the reason, he suddenly looked directly at me. I'll never forget that moment. Even from a distance, I knew he'd seen me. Our eyes met, and everything changed. The attack stopped. The man's attention shifted entirely toward me. For one horrifying second, nobody moved. Then he lunged forward, straight at me. I don't remember making a conscious decision. I didn't scream. I didn't think. I just turned and ran. Every survival instinct in my body took over. I spun around and sprinted in the opposite direction. Looking back now, my route made absolutely no sense. Instead of running toward the bright streets and businesses, I headed toward a dark, grassy area that ran alongside a park and creek. Even today, I don't know why. Maybe panic took over. Maybe it was simply the closest direction available. Whatever the reason, I ran straight into darkness. Rain soaked my clothes. My shoes slipped on wet grass. My lungs burned. I could hear my own breathing louder than anything else. The fear was overwhelming. I genuinely believed he was behind me. I kept expecting to feel a hand grab my shoulder, to hear footsteps getting closer, to be tackled from behind. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran. Every second felt endless. Eventually, I reached the main road. Bright lights. Traffic, civilization, safety. Or at least what I hoped was safety. By that point, I was completely exhausted, out of breath, shaking, panicking. Then, in what felt like some kind of cruel joke, I saw a police car. For a split second, I felt relief. Finally, someone who could help. Someone who could stop whatever was happening. Someone who could find that woman. The problem was the police car wasn't close enough. It was already moving past. I waved. Nothing. I tried to get its attention. Nothing. The car kept going. I remember feeling desperate. Absolutely desperate. So I started screaming. I screamed as loudly as I could. I shouted for help. I yelled toward the road, toward nearby houses, toward anyone. No one came. No one responded. Whether nobody heard me because of the rain or simply didn't realize what was happening, I don't know. All I know is that nobody stopped. Nobody appeared. Nobody asked what was wrong. Eventually, I made it home. Physically, I was okay. Emotionally, I was a wreck. I remember trying to explain what had happened, trying to remember details, trying to figure out exactly where the attack had occurred. But everything had happened so quickly. I couldn't provide a precise address. I couldn't confidently describe the man. I couldn't even be sure exactly which lawn the attack happened on. The entire event had unfolded in seconds. And because I ran, I never saw how it ended. That's the part that still bothers me. Not my fear, not the rain, not even the fact that the man charged toward me. It's her, the woman. I still think about her sometimes. I wonder who she was. I wonder whether she escaped. I wonder whether someone eventually helped her. I wonder whether she survived that night. There are moments when certain memories fade with time. This isn't one of them. More than 20 years later, I can still picture the rain. I can still hear the scream. I can still see her running across that lawn with the man chasing close behind. And despite all these years passing, one thought remains exactly the same. I hope she made it home. I hope she got away. And I hope that wherever she is now, she got the chance to live a life far removed from whatever happened on that dark, rainy night. One of the most frightening experiences from my childhood happened when I was around 12 years old, and even though it lasted only a few seconds, I still remember it more clearly than many events that took place years later. This was long before smartphones, social media, and the internet became part of everyday life. Back then, if you wanted to see your friends, you got on your bike and rode around town until you found them. I grew up in Santa Barbara, California, and like a lot of kids my age, my friends and I spent most of our free time outdoors. During summer breaks and weekends, we'd leave home in the morning and sometimes wouldn't return until dinner. Our parents usually had only a rough idea of where we were, and that was considered perfectly normal. The four of us rode our bikes everywhere. We explored neighborhoods. We rode through parks. We followed creeks. We searched for shortcuts. Any place we hadn't been before immediately became a destination. At 12 years old, the world still felt full of mystery. Every empty field looked like an adventure. Every abandoned lot looked like it might contain something interesting. Most of the time, those adventures turned out to be completely boring. Occasionally, we'd discover a hidden trail or a good place to build a fort. And sometimes we'd find ourselves somewhere we probably shouldn't have been. One afternoon, we ended up near a large, undeveloped lot on the edge of town. I couldn't tell you exactly where it was anymore, but I remember the area surprisingly well. The property was huge. At least it seemed huge to us. Looking back, it was probably around 10 acres or so. Most of it consisted of dry scrub brush, patches of dirt, and scattered weeds. There wasn't much to look at from a distance, which was probably why none of us had ever paid much attention to it before. One side bordered a set of train tracks. Another section contained a small, wooded area. The trees weren't particularly dense, but they were thick enough that you couldn't see very far inside. To a group of 12-year-old boys, that immediately made the place interesting. We rode around the perimeter for a while, looking for a way in. Eventually, we found ourselves standing near the edge of the woods. Our bikes lay scattered nearby while we debated what to do. Part of us wanted to explore. Part of us wasn't so sure. The woods weren't large, but they were dark compared to the open lot. From where we stood, the trees seemed strangely quiet. No visible trails. No signs that people regularly walked through there. Just a wall of branches and shadows. One of my friends insisted we should go in. Another thought it looked creepy. The rest of us bounced back and forth between excitement and hesitation. The conversation couldn't have lasted more than a minute or two. We were all standing there, looking toward the trees, trying to decide whether to ride through them or turn around. Then it happened. A sudden sound cracked through the air. At first, I didn't understand what I was hearing. It was sharp and metallic, a strange rattling noise. Instinctively, all four of us looked up. The source of the sound was a tree only a short distance away, and sticking out of the trunk was a knife. A very large knife. Even now, decades later, that image remains frozen in my memory. The blade was buried in the wood, freshly embedded, still vibrating. The handle shook back and forth as the blade settled into the trunk. There was absolutely no question about what had happened. Someone had just thrown it. Not earlier, not minutes ago, seconds ago. The knife was still moving. I remember staring at it in complete disbelief. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. One moment, we had been arguing about whether to explore the woods. The next, a massive knife was sticking out of a tree beside us. What terrified me most wasn't the knife itself. It was what the knife implied. Somebody had thrown it. Somebody close enough to hit that tree. And none of us had seen who it was. The realization hit all four of us at roughly the same time. We weren't alone. The woods suddenly felt very different. The silence that had seemed peaceful moments earlier now felt threatening. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every patch of trees looked like a possible hiding place. I don't remember anyone saying a word. I honestly don't think we needed to. The decision was unanimous. Leave immediately. 1 second, we were standing there, staring at the knife. The next, we were diving for our bikes. I've ridden bicycles my entire life. I've raced friends. I've ridden downhill at ridiculous speeds. I've pedaled through storms and steep hills. But I can honestly say I have never pedaled faster than I did that day. Pure fear is an incredible source of motivation. We launched ourselves out of that lot like our lives depended on it. Maybe they did. I remember glancing back once, just once. The knife remained in the tree. The woods remained silent. I couldn't see anyone. But somehow that made it even worse. At least if we had seen someone, there would have been an explanation. Instead, there was only uncertainty. Who threw it? Why? Had they been aiming at the tree? At us? Was it some kind of warning? A prank? An accident? We had no idea. And frankly, none of us wanted to stick around long enough to find out. By the time we reached safer streets, we were completely out of breath. Everyone talked at once, each of us describing the same thing. Each of us confirming that, yes, we had all seen it. The knife, the rattling, the sudden appearance. The fact that none of us had seen where it came from. When I finally got home and explained what happened, the adults reacted much differently than we had. They weren't excited. They weren't curious. They were concerned. One of our mothers ended up calling the police. At the time, that felt like the right thing to do. A group of kids had nearly been struck by a knife in an isolated area. At least, that was how it felt to us. I don't know exactly what the police did afterward. If they searched the area, nobody ever told us. If they found anything, we never heard about it. The adults discussed it for a while, but eventually the story faded from conversation. For us kids, however, it never really went away, because unlike the adults, we had been standing there. We had heard the sound. We had seen that knife shaking in the tree. We had experienced that sudden realization that somebody unseen was nearby. The undeveloped lot quickly became a place we avoided. Before that day, it had represented adventure. Afterward, it represented something else entirely. Danger. None of us were interested in exploring those woods anymore. In fact, I don't think any of us ever went back. Not once. Years later, I've often wondered what actually happened. Part of me hopes it was some teenager messing around. Maybe someone practicing knife throwing. Maybe someone who didn't realize kids were nearby. Maybe some strange coincidence. But another part of me isn't so sure. Because if it had been an accident, why did the knife appear exactly when we were discussing entering the woods? Why did it land in a tree so close to us? And why did none of us ever see another person? Those questions have never been answered. All I know is that one ordinary afternoon, 4 12-year-old boys stood at the edge of a patch of woods debating whether to explore. Then, a knife appeared in a tree beside them. And within seconds, every one of them decided that exploring somewhere else sounded like a much better idea. To this day, whenever someone asks me about the scariest moment of my childhood, that's the story that immediately comes to mind. Not because anything actually happened to us, but because sometimes the things you don't see are far more frightening than the things you do. One of the most frightening experiences from my childhood happened when I was around 12 years old, and even though it lasted only a few seconds, I still remember it more clearly than many events that took place years later. This was long before smartphones, social media, and the internet became part of everyday life. Back then, if you wanted to see your friends, you got on your bike and rode around town until you found them. I grew up in Santa Barbara, California, and like a lot of kids my age, my friends and I spent most of our free time outdoors. During summer breaks and weekends, we'd leave home in the morning and sometimes wouldn't return until dinner. Our parents usually had only a rough idea of where we were, and that was considered perfectly normal. The four of us rode our bikes everywhere. We explored neighborhoods. We rode through parks. We followed creeks. We searched for shortcuts. Any place we hadn't been before immediately became a destination. At 12 years old, the world still felt full of mystery. Every empty field looked like an adventure. Every abandoned lot looked like it might contain something interesting. Most of the time, those adventures turned out to be completely boring. Occasionally, we'd discover a hidden trail or a good place to build a fort. And sometimes we'd find ourselves somewhere we probably shouldn't have been. One afternoon, we ended up near a large, undeveloped lot on the edge of town. I couldn't tell you exactly where it was anymore, but I remember the area surprisingly well. The property was huge. At least, it seemed huge to us. Looking back, it was probably around 10 acres or so. Most of it consisted of dry scrub brush, patches of dirt, and scattered weeds. There wasn't much to look at from a distance, which was probably why none of us had ever paid much attention to it before. One side bordered a set of train tracks. Another section contained a small wooded area. The trees weren't particularly dense, but they were thick enough that you couldn't see very far inside. To a group of 12-year-old boys, that immediately made the place interesting. We rode around the perimeter for a while, looking for a way in. Eventually, we found ourselves standing near the edge of the woods. Our bikes lay scattered nearby while we debated what to do. Part of us wanted to explore. Part of us wasn't so sure. The woods weren't large, but they were dark compared to the open lot. From where we stood, the trees seemed strangely quiet. No visible trails. No signs that people regularly walked through there, just a wall of branches and shadows. One of my friends insisted we should go in. Another thought it looked creepy. The rest of us bounced back and forth between excitement and hesitation. The conversation couldn't have lasted more than a minute or two. We were all standing there, looking toward the trees, trying to decide whether to ride through them or turn around. Then it happened. A sudden sound cracked through the air. At first, I didn't understand what I was hearing. It was sharp and metallic, a strange rattling noise. Instinctively, all four of us looked up. The source of the sound was a tree only a short distance away, and sticking out of the trunk was a knife, a very large knife. Even now, decades later, that image remains frozen in my memory. The blade was buried in the wood, freshly embedded, still vibrating. The handle shook back and forth as the blade settled into the trunk. There was absolutely no question about what had happened. Someone had just thrown it. Not earlier, not minutes ago, seconds ago. The knife was still moving. I remember staring at it in complete disbelief. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. One moment, we had been arguing about whether to explore the woods. The next, a massive knife was sticking out of a tree beside us. What terrified me most wasn't the knife itself. It was what the knife implied. Somebody had thrown it. Somebody close enough to hit that tree. And none of us had seen who it was. The realization hit all four of us at roughly the same time. We weren't alone. The woods suddenly felt very different. The silence that had seemed peaceful moments earlier now felt threatening. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every patch of trees looked like a possible hiding place. I don't remember anyone saying a word. I honestly don't think we needed to. The decision was unanimous. Leave immediately. 1 second we were standing there, staring at the knife. The next we were diving for our bikes. I've ridden bicycles my entire life. I've raced friends. I've ridden downhill at ridiculous speeds. I've pedaled through storms and steep hills. But I can honestly say I have never pedaled faster than I did that day. Pure fear is an incredible source of motivation. We launched ourselves out of that lot like our lives depended on it. Maybe they did. I remember glancing back once. Just once. The knife remained in the tree. The woods remained silent. I couldn't see anyone, but somehow that made it even worse. At least if we had seen someone, there would have been an explanation. Instead, there was only uncertainty. Who threw it? Why? Had they been aiming at the tree? At us? Was it some kind of warning? A prank? An accident? We had no idea. And frankly, none of us wanted to stick around long enough to find out. By the time we reached safer streets, we were completely out of breath. Everyone talked at once, each of us describing the same thing. Each of us confirming that yes, we had all seen it. The knife, the rattling, the sudden appearance. The fact that none of us had seen where it came from. When I finally got home and explained what happened, the adults reacted much differently than we had. They weren't excited. They weren't curious. They were concerned. One of our mothers ended up calling the police. At the time, that felt like the right thing to do. A group of kids had nearly been struck by a knife in an isolated area. At least, that was how it felt to us. I don't know exactly what the police did afterward. If they searched the area, nobody ever told us. If they found anything, we never heard about it. The adults discussed it for a while, but eventually the story faded from conversation. For us kids, however, it never really went away. Because unlike the adults, we had been standing there. We had heard the sound. We had seen that knife shaking in the tree. We had experienced that sudden realization that somebody unseen was nearby. The undeveloped lot quickly became a place we avoided. Before that day, it had represented adventure. Afterward, it represented something else entirely. Danger. None of us were interested in exploring those woods anymore. In fact, I don't think any of us ever went back. Not once. Years later, I've often wondered what actually happened. Part of me hopes it was some teenager messing around. Maybe someone practicing knife throwing. Maybe someone who didn't realize kids were nearby. Maybe some strange coincidence. But another part of me isn't so sure. Because if it had been an accident, why did the knife appear exactly when we were discussing entering the woods? Why did it land in a tree so close to us? And why did none of us ever see another person? Those questions have never been answered. All I know is that one ordinary afternoon, 4 12-year-old boys stood at the edge of a patch of woods debating whether to explore. Then a knife appeared in a tree beside them. And within seconds, every one of them decided that exploring somewhere else sounded like a much better idea. To this day, whenever someone asks me about the scariest moment of my childhood, that's the story that immediately comes to mind. Not because anything actually happened to us, but because sometimes the things you don't see are far more frightening than the things you do. 11, when I was about 12 years old, I went on what should have been a normal Boy Scout camping trip. Instead, it turned into the most chaotic, terrifying, and unbelievable week of my entire life. Even now, years later, I struggle to tell the story without sounding like I'm making parts of it up. If someone else told me everything that happened during that single week, I'd probably assume they were exaggerating. But every bit of it actually happened. The trip took place at Camp La Noche, a Boy Scout camp located deep in the forests of central Florida. At the time, it felt like the middle of nowhere. There were miles of woods, swamps, lakes, trails and wildlife in every direction. For a 12-year-old kid, it was both exciting and intimidating. The scouts slept in old-fashioned two-man A-frame canvas tents. They were simple structures with an opening on each end and a narrow aisle running down the middle. One cot sat on either side of the aisle, and underneath each cot was a storage chest where we kept our gear. The tents were arranged in a circle around a central area, with the bathrooms and activity buildings located some distance away. The first few days were fairly normal. Then, things started getting weird. One night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought my tent mate was snoring. The sound was low, heavy, and rhythmic. Still half asleep, I rolled over to look toward his cot. That's when my brain stopped working. Instead of seeing my tent mate, I saw a black bear standing inside our tent. For several seconds, I couldn't even process what I was looking at. The bear filled most of the opening between our cots. Its dark shape seemed enormous inside the small tent. I remember instantly becoming frozen. Not figuratively, literally frozen. I was terrified that any movement might attract its attention. The bear wasn't interested in me. It was focused entirely on the storage chest beneath my tent mate's cot. I listened as it sniffed, pawed, and pushed at the chest. The sound I had mistaken for snoring was actually a bear breathing. Looking back, that's somehow even more horrifying. For several minutes, I lay completely still while the bear tried to figure out how to get inside. My heart was pounding so hard, I was convinced it could hear it. Thankfully, the chest was locked. Eventually, the bear seemed to lose interest. After one final shove, it turned around and wandered back out of the tent. I remained frozen long after it was gone. The next morning, I immediately told my tent mate. His reaction surprised me. Instead of being shocked, he admitted he had hidden food inside the storage chest. In Boy Scouts, that was one of the biggest rules you could break in bear country. You never kept food in your tent. Suddenly everything made sense. The bear hadn't randomly chosen our tent. It had smelled the food. Even after hearing this, my tent mate still didn't fully believe me. He acknowledged that his chest had been moved around, but he remained skeptical about the bear. When I reported it to the troop leaders, they mainly focused on the hidden food. We both got in trouble. As for the bear itself, I don't think many people truly believed my story. That should have been the end of it. Unfortunately, it wasn't. The following night, my tent mate was sleeping somewhere else, leaving me alone in the tent. Just before lights out, I realized I needed to use the bathroom. Normally, I'd walk to the restroom building, but our tent happened to be the farthest one from it. Like many lazy 12-year-olds, I decided it would be easier to simply step outside and pee on a nearby tree. So I grabbed my flashlight and walked into the darkness. The woods were quiet. I was doing my business and casually shining my flashlight around, mostly to make sure nobody was nearby. The beam swept across trees, bushes, and patches of grass. Then I saw two bright reflections. Eyes. At first I wasn't worried. My immediate assumption was raccoon. There were plenty of raccoons around camp. I kept moving the flashlight. Then something made me pause. I moved the beam back. The eyes were still there, watching me. I held the light steady. And there, staring directly at me from the darkness, was another black bear. For a split second, we simply looked at each other. Then, every survival instinct in my body activated at once. I ran. I didn't finish what I was doing. I didn't think. I just ran. In my panic, I managed to urinate all over myself while sprinting toward the nearest occupied tent. I burst inside and started yelling about the bear. My friends immediately assumed I was overreacting. But I was so visibly terrified that even they became nervous. Eventually, a group of us decided to notify the scoutmasters. Because this was now the second bear encounter in 2 nights, they finally took me more seriously. 2 adult leaders went out to investigate. They searched the area. They found nothing. No bear, no tracks, nothing. While they didn't openly accuse me of lying, I could tell many of them remained skeptical. After all, what were the odds? Unfortunately, the odds were about to get even worse. The next day, 4 of us came up with a brilliant idea. And by brilliant, I mean incredibly stupid. We made makeshift fishing poles and hid them near the lake. Our plan was to sneak out after lights out and go fishing. At 12 years old, this seemed like the greatest adventure imaginable. That night, we waited until everyone was asleep and slipped out of camp. The lake looked beautiful in the darkness. The air was cool. The water was calm. We saw all sorts of wildlife. Alligators gliding through the water, birds moving through the reeds, sounds from the swamp surrounding us. For a while, everything was perfect. Then we noticed something hovering over the water. At first, I thought it was a reflection. Then I realized it wasn't attached to anything. It was a glowing green ball floating silently above the lake. The thing was roughly 2 feet across. Its shape flickered like a flame, and it appeared to be moving toward us. Now, as an adult, I know about swamp gas and will owe the wisp phenomena. At 12 years old, we thought it was an alien. No joke. The moment it started drifting in our direction, we panicked. Fishing was immediately abandoned. We grabbed our gear and hurried away from the lake, trying to act calm, trying not to run, trying not to admit we were all terrified. Then we rounded a bend in the trail and came face to face with another bear. This one was huge, at least compared to the others. It stood perhaps 30 feet away on the path. For a moment, everyone froze. Then the bear stood up on its hind legs. The sight was incredible and terrifying. It looked twice as large standing upright. Then it let out a roar. I've never seen 4 kids reverse direction faster. We immediately turned around and sprinted back toward the lake. Our reasoning was simple. The camp owner lived near the dock. Getting caught sneaking out was preferable to becoming bear food. We ran harder than I thought possible. Fortunately, the bear didn't chase us. When we reached the camp owner's house, we were crying, screaming, and pounding on the door. Eventually, he answered. To his credit, he didn't seem particularly surprised. To our disappointment, he wasn't particularly sympathetic either. After hearing our story, he grabbed his shotgun and climbed into his golf cart. Then he informed us he would escort us back to camp. Escort, not transport. We still had to walk. At that point, we'd have followed him through a hurricane if necessary. The image remains burned into my memory. The camp owner driving slowly through the darkness, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on a shotgun. 4 terrified kids walking behind him. When we arrived back at camp, we were thoroughly reprimanded for sneaking out. But nobody seemed especially interested in the bear story. Again, at this point, we'd encountered 3 separate bears in 3 days. Most adults assumed we were exaggerating, and honestly, I understand why. The story sounded ridiculous. The 4 of us refused to sleep in our tents that night. Instead, we slept in the activities building. No amount of punishment was convincing us to go back outside. Then, 2 days later, everything changed. The camp suddenly went into lockdown. Early that morning, a young black bear had broken into the snack hut. Not merely wandered near it, broken into it. The bear had become so comfortable around humans that wildlife officials decided it could no longer safely remain in the area. It was tranquilized. Later, we learned it had been euthanized. When I eventually saw a photograph of the animal, my stomach dropped. It was the same size as the bear I'd encountered alone on both occasions. I became convinced it was the same bear, and strangely, I felt sad. Terrified or not, the bear had never actually harmed me. It had simply been hungry. Curious, far too comfortable around people. The larger bear we encountered on the trail was likely its mother. That explanation suddenly made everything make sense. You'd think that would be enough excitement for one camping trip. It wasn't. Near the end of the week, a man somehow obtained a scoutmaster uniform, entered the camp, and robbed my tent mate at knife point. Yes, actually robbed him. At knife point, in a Boy Scout camp. The details were unbelievable, yet somehow completely fitting given how insane the week had already become. As if that wasn't enough, we also experienced severe thunderstorms, flash flooding, tornado warnings, and my best friend broke his ankle. Every day seemed to introduce a new disaster. By the time the trip ended, I felt like I'd survived some bizarre adventure movie. Even today, it's difficult to explain just how absurd the entire week was. Bears inside tents, bears outside tents, floating green lights, sneaking out at night, being chased by wildlife, floods, storms, and armed robbery, injuries, and constant disbelief from nearly everyone around us. I've had many memorable experiences since then, but nothing has ever matched that single week in Florida. If somebody else told me this story, I'd probably assume they were combining several different events into one. Yet somehow, it all happened within the span of a few days. And more than anything else, that's why it remains the most unbelievable week of my life. I've rewritten and expanded the story into a longer, smoother narrative while keeping it close to the original account, preserving the fear, uncertainty, and emotional impact. Years ago, I lived in a block of flats that had a reputation among some of the residents. Nobody could prove anything was wrong with the place, and there was never any hard evidence that anything paranormal was happening. But more than a few people quietly admitted they felt uncomfortable there. It wasn't the kind of building that looked creepy from the outside. It was an ordinary block of flats, attached to a small convenience shop at ground level. People came and went, families lived there, kids played outside, and life seemed normal enough. But every now and then, someone would mention hearing things, strange noises at night, the feeling of being watched, unsettling dreams. Most people laughed it off. I did too, at least in the beginning. Then something happened that changed the way I looked at that place forever. At the time, I was living there with my young son, who was only 2 years old. Like most parents of toddlers, I was permanently exhausted. Between work, daily responsibilities, and looking after a small child, getting a full night's sleep felt like a luxury. One night, I was asleep in bed when something woke me. At first, I wasn't fully conscious. I remember feeling pressure on my chest, almost like someone was pushing down on me. It wasn't painful, just heavy, uncomfortable. The sensation was strong enough that I opened my eyes. The moment I did, my entire body went cold. Hovering above me in the darkness were 2 bright white eyes and a mouth full of white teeth. For a second, my brain couldn't understand what I was looking at. The darkness of the room seemed to swallow everything else, leaving only those eyes and that unnaturally bright grin. I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong. Then, adrenaline took over. I jumped out of bed and lunged toward the light switch. The second the room lit up, I turned around. What I saw next remains one of the most terrifying images of my life. Standing beside my son's bed was a figure. A man. At least it looked like a man. He was leaning over my child, watching him. The figure was incredibly dark, almost like a silhouette cut out from the darkness itself. Yet somehow, I could still make out details. The same white eyes, the same bright teeth, the same smile. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then panic exploded through me. I screamed, "Get away from him." The words came out louder than I intended. My entire focus was on my son. The figure slowly turned its head toward me and smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a normal smile, a smile that somehow made everything worse. The expression felt deliberate, almost amused. Then it moved. To this day, I struggle to describe exactly what happened. The figure didn't simply run away. It moved in a way that seemed unnatural, almost impossible. It looked as though it was running up an invisible spiral staircase. Its body rose and twisted as it moved. Its arms and legs appeared unusually long, far too long. Each movement seemed wrong somehow, like watching a person move in a way that people aren't supposed to move. Within seconds, it was gone. The room was empty. I didn't stop to investigate. I didn't search the flat. I didn't look for explanations. I grabbed my son and got out. Immediately, I threw clothes on as fast as I could, picked him up, and left. The entire drive to my mom's house felt like a blur. I don't remember much except fear. Pure fear. When I arrived, I was shaking so badly that I could barely explain what had happened. Of course, nobody really believed me. Some thought it was a nightmare. Others suggested sleep paralysis. A few people assumed stress had caused me to imagine it. I understood why they felt that way. If somebody had told me the same story, I probably would have questioned it too. But I knew what I had seen. At least, I believed I did. A few days later, something happened that made the experience even harder to dismiss. I was in the small shop attached to the flats when I met one of my new neighbors. We started talking. Almost immediately, we discovered something strange. She had the same first name as me. Even stranger, her child had the same name as my son, although the spelling was slightly different. It felt like one of those bizarre coincidences people laugh about. We chatted for a while about the building and how she was settling in. Eventually, I asked the usual question. "How are you liking the place so far?" She hesitated. Then she said she wasn't sleeping very well. Naturally, I asked why. I've always been a bit nosy. She laughed nervously and said she'd been having weird dreams. I asked what kind of dreams. Her expression changed. She lowered her voice slightly. Then she described seeing a black man standing in her doorway at night, watching her. A man with bright white eyes and bright white teeth. For a second, I just stared at her. The hairs on my arms stood up. She continued describing the figure. Every detail matched what I had seen. The eyes, the smile, the feeling of being watched. Everything. I interrupted her and told her my own story. The look on her face told me immediately that she wasn't making it up. She looked as shocked as I felt. Neither of us could explain it. Neither of us could prove anything. But both of us had described the same figure independently. When we told other people, nobody believed us. Not really. Friends laughed. Family members offered logical explanations. People suggested stress, dreams, coincidence, or imagination. Eventually, both of us moved out. Life moved on. For a while, I tried not to think about the flat. Then, my aunt called me. A cousin's friend, along with her boyfriend and baby, had moved into my old apartment. My aunt wanted to know if I could stop by and collect some clothes I had apparently left behind. At first I agreed, then she told me something else. The new family was already experiencing problems. Weird things had been happening. Strange noises. Unexplained incidents. The usual sort of stories people tend to dismiss. Then, one night, their baby began screaming. The parents rushed into the room. When they picked the child up, they discovered something terrifying. The baby's onesie had 3 large slashes cut through it. Not small tears, not worn fabric. Slashes, the baby wasn't seriously injured, but the clothing had clearly been damaged. Nobody could explain how. Hearing that immediately brought back every uncomfortable memory I had tried to forget. The following day, my cousin and I went to the flat. The plan was simple: collect my remaining belongings and leave. The moment I opened the front door, everything changed. A feeling hit me instantly. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something deeper, heavier, like dread. The sensation settled into my stomach and chest so suddenly that it almost took my breath away. I've never experienced anything quite like it before or since. It felt as though every instinct in my body was telling me not to go inside. Not later. Not eventually. Immediately, leave. I stood there for several seconds trying to push through it. I couldn't. The feeling only got worse. My chest tightened. My stomach twisted. I felt genuinely convinced that if I walked deeper into that flat, something terrible would happen. Eventually, I turned around and walked back out. I couldn't do it. I left everything behind. The clothes, the belongings, everything, as far as I know. The family who moved in didn't stay much longer either. From what I heard, they eventually left most of their possessions behind and moved back in with their parents. I've never been able to verify every detail of what happened after that. All I know is that multiple people experienced things they couldn't explain. People who didn't know each other. People who had no reason to invent the same story. Even now, whenever I tell this story, most people assume there's a logical explanation. Maybe there is. Maybe what I saw was a nightmare. Maybe the neighbor's dreams were coincidence. Maybe the damaged clothing had a perfectly ordinary cause. Maybe the overwhelming fear I felt when returning to the flat was simply anxiety. I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. I woke up one night and saw something standing over my son. A woman I barely knew described the exact same figure without any prompting. And years later, the memory of stepping back into that flat still gives me a feeling I can't fully explain. People don't have to believe me. Most don't. But every word of this story is exactly as I remember it. And that is why, even after all these years, I still avoid talking about that flat whenever I can. A few years ago, my husband and I took a trip to Kyoto. It had always been one of those places we wanted to visit together. We spent our days wandering through quiet streets, visiting temples, exploring little shops, and trying local food. By the time our third night arrived, we were completely exhausted from walking all day. We got back to the hotel much earlier than we normally would have. Our original plan had been to rest for an hour and then head back out to explore the city at night, but the second we lay down, both of us fell asleep almost immediately. Our hotel room wasn't anything unusual. It was clean, quiet, and comfortable. Instead of one large bed, it had 2 twin beds sitting a few feet apart. We each slept in our own bed with a small table between them. Everything about the room felt perfectly normal when we went to sleep. Sometime during the night, my husband suddenly woke up. At first, he couldn't explain why. There hadn't been a loud noise. Nothing had fallen over. The room was completely quiet. Yet he instantly had the unmistakable feeling that someone else was inside the room with us. Still half asleep, he assumed it was probably a member of the hotel staff. Many hotels offer evening turn-down service, and because we'd gone to bed ridiculously early, he figured someone had opened the door, noticed we were asleep, and quietly decided not to disturb us. For a few seconds, that explanation seemed perfectly reasonable. Then, he realized something strange. He never heard the door close. He lay there listening. The room was silent. If someone had entered and then left, surely he would have heard the door shutting behind them. The feeling that someone was nearby didn't disappear. It actually became stronger. Finally, he sat up in bed and looked around the room. Nobody. The bathroom was empty. The curtains were still closed. Nothing appeared out of place. Still uneasy, he walked over and carefully opened the hotel room door. The hallway outside was completely empty. No staff members, no footsteps, no carts. Nothing. After standing there for a moment, he eventually convinced himself that he must have imagined the entire thing. Maybe he'd only been half awake. Maybe it was one of those strange moments where your mind plays tricks on you during the transition between sleep and being awake. He went back to bed without waking me. I slept through the entire thing. At least, that's what I thought. Later that same night, I woke up too. I wasn't fully awake right away. Because we'd fallen asleep so much earlier than usual, my body felt completely confused. I had no idea what time it was. For a few moments, I simply lay there, staring into the darkness, trying to wake up. The room was quiet. I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning and my husband's steady breathing across the room. Everything seemed peaceful. As my eyes adjusted, I slowly looked around the room. Then, something caught my attention. The upper left corner of the room looked much darker than the rest. At first, I didn't think much of it. Shadows look strange in unfamiliar hotel rooms. Light from outside often creates odd shapes on walls and ceilings. I continued staring anyway. Something about that corner didn't seem right. The darkness looked thicker somehow, almost solid. I kept watching. Then it moved. Not dramatically, not quickly. Just enough that I instantly knew I wasn't imagining it. Every bit of sleepiness disappeared. I stared without blinking. The dark shape slowly shifted. It looked almost like a black mass separating itself from the corner of the room. The more I watched it, the stronger a terrible feeling grew inside me. I can't describe it any other way except to say it felt evil, not simply frightening, not just unusual. There was an overwhelming feeling that whatever I was looking at wasn't supposed to be there. The darkness continued moving, very slowly. It slid down the wall toward the floor. Its movement wasn't natural. It wasn't like a shadow changing because of light. It looked deliberate, almost alive. Once it reached the floor, I could no longer see it clearly from where I was lying. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made everything worse. Now I didn't know where it was. I couldn't tell if it had stopped moving or if it was coming toward me. Panic started building inside me. I immediately tried calling out to my husband. No sound came out. At first, I thought I was just too frightened to speak. I tried again. Nothing. My mouth opened. My mind screamed. But my voice simply wouldn't work. Fear rushed through my entire body. I decided to reach across and shake my husband awake. The moment I tried to move, I realized I couldn't. My arms wouldn't respond. My legs wouldn't move. My entire body felt frozen. I was completely awake. I knew exactly where I was. I could think clearly. Yet I couldn't move a single muscle. That was the moment true panic set in. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. I fought with everything I had to move. Nothing happened. Meanwhile, that awful feeling continued growing stronger. Although I couldn't clearly see the dark shape anymore, I could somehow sense exactly where it was. It felt closer, much closer. Every instinct I had told me it was approaching my bed. The room suddenly felt colder. The silence became overwhelming. I could hear my own breathing becoming faster. I could feel every heartbeat echoing through my body. Then I sensed movement at the foot of my bed. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see a person. But I knew something was there. The feeling was so powerful that I became convinced the darkness had reached my bed. It felt as though it was slowly coming over the footboard. Closer, closer. I honestly believed I was about to die. Looking back now, that sounds dramatic. But in that moment, there wasn't a single doubt in my mind. I thought whatever was in that room was about to touch me. I became absolutely certain it was reaching toward my feet beneath the blanket. Every part of me screamed to move, to run, to wake my husband, but my body refused to obey. Then, at the exact moment I became convinced it was about to touch my foot, something changed. With one sudden burst of movement, my body responded. I threw the blankets off, sat straight up in bed, and instantly everything stopped. The paralysis disappeared. The pressure vanished. The overwhelming feeling of evil was simply gone. The room looked completely normal again. There was no dark figure, no moving shadow, no strange shape in the corner. Only an ordinary hotel room in complete silence. I sat there, breathing heavily for several minutes. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing. I looked into every corner of the room, expecting to see something. There was nothing. Part of me wanted to turn every light on immediately. Another part of me was terrified that if I did, I'd see something standing there. I considered waking my husband. I considered climbing into his bed. I even thought about leaving the room entirely. Instead, I just sat there, trying to calm myself down. Eventually, my breathing slowed. The room remained perfectly quiet. Little by little, exhaustion returned. As unbelievable as it sounds, I eventually lay back down and managed to fall asleep again. When morning came, sunlight poured through the curtains. Everything suddenly felt normal. For a brief moment, I wondered if the entire experience had simply been a nightmare. Then, my husband started telling me about his night. Before I even mentioned what had happened to me, he explained how he'd woken up feeling that someone was inside the room. He described believing it was hotel staff. He told me about checking the hallway and finding nobody there. As he talked, I felt a chill run through me. Then I shared my own experience. I told him about the strange darkness in the corner, the overwhelming feeling that something evil was in the room, the paralysis, the sensation that it had approached my bed, the moment I finally managed to move again. Neither of us said much after that. We simply sat there looking at each other, trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe my experience was sleep paralysis. Maybe his feeling of someone being in the room was just one of those strange moments between sleeping and waking. Maybe the timing was nothing more than an incredible coincidence. We honestly don't know. We've stayed in dozens of hotels since that trip and never experienced anything remotely similar again. Years have passed, but we still occasionally bring up that third night in Kyoto. Not because we have an explanation, but because two different people woke up in the same hotel room on the same night, each convinced that something else had been there with us. And neither of us has ever been able to completely forget how real it felt. Looking back now, it almost sounds impossible. Today, everyone knows what COVID-19 became. Everyone remembers the lockdowns, the empty streets, the panic buying, the masks, and the fear that spread across the world. But there was a time when almost nobody believed it would happen, especially in the UK. For me, that period was one of the loneliest and most frustrating experiences of my life. At the time, I was working in health and safety. It wasn't a job I particularly enjoyed, and I eventually left it. But during those years, it was my responsibility to monitor risks and make sure our company was prepared for potential problems. One ordinary day, I was given what sounded like a simple task. Our company had an office in China. and I was asked to purchase protective face masks for the employees working there. At first, I thought it would be easy. Masks were common products, there were hundreds of suppliers around the world, and ordering a large quantity usually wasn't difficult. But the moment I started making calls and sending emails, I realized something wasn't right. Every supplier I contacted gave me the same answer. Sold out. No stock available. No estimated delivery date. I contacted another supplier. Then another. Then another. The answer never changed. Within a few hours, I had spoken to companies across multiple countries, and every single one of them had completely sold out. That immediately caught my attention. Something significant had to be happening for the entire global supply of protective masks to disappear almost overnight. Curiosity quickly turned into concern. Instead of simply accepting the shortage, I started researching why it was happening. Every evening after work, I found myself reading news articles, watching interviews, and searching for information coming out of China. The deeper I looked, the more disturbing everything became. There were reports of a mysterious new virus spreading rapidly through parts of China. Hospitals were filling up. Medical staff were becoming overwhelmed. Official statements seemed calm, but independent reports painted a very different picture. What disturbed me the most were the videos posted by Chinese doctors. Some of them appeared online pleading for people to take the outbreak seriously. They described hospitals overflowing with patients. They warned that the situation was much worse than publicly admitted. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, many of those doctors stopped posting. Some disappeared completely. Stories began circulating that people who tried to raise the alarm were being silenced. Whether every report was accurate or not, one thing became obvious to me. This wasn't an ordinary outbreak. It had the potential to become something much larger. The more information I gathered, the more convinced I became that the virus wouldn't stay contained. Eventually, it would reach Europe. And if that happened, life would change dramatically. I tried warning people. That turned out to be far more difficult than I expected. At work, I brought up the issue during meetings. I explained what I had discovered. I talked about supply shortages. I explained why masks had disappeared. I warned that businesses should begin preparing while there was still time. Most people smiled politely. Others laughed. Some openly joked that I had been reading too much on the internet. Meeting after meeting ended the same way. Nobody believed me. Not one person. I wasn't predicting the end of the world. In fact, the things I imagined weren't even close to how serious the situation would eventually become. I simply believed it would spread internationally and cause major disruption. Even those relatively cautious predictions sounded ridiculous to everyone else. Outside work, the reactions weren't much different. Friends brushed it off. Family members told me I was worrying over nothing. Even my therapist became concerned. When I described what I believed was coming, they questioned whether anxiety was affecting my judgment. At one point, I genuinely started wondering whether they were right. When every single person around you dismisses your concerns, it's difficult not to question yourself. Still, the evidence kept pointing in the same direction. So I continued preparing. 1 week before everything changed, I made a decision that embarrassed my family. My mother attended church regularly. The congregation was made up mostly of elderly people, many with existing health conditions. During communion, everyone would line up closely together. By then, I'd become convinced that if this virus reached the UK, that tradition could become incredibly dangerous. I contacted my mother's priest. I explained my concerns as calmly as I could. I told him that he should seriously consider stopping communion temporarily. I explained that if one infected person stood at the front of the line, They could unknowingly expose dozens of vulnerable people in a matter of minutes. I wasn't trying to frighten anyone. I honestly believed I was helping. Instead, the priest became concerned about me. Not because of the virus, because of my mental health. He contacted my mother and explained that he thought I might not be coping well. That conversation hurt more than I expected. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I simply believed I had stumbled across something important. But from everyone else's perspective, I sounded irrational. Despite that, I continued changing my own habits. Long before anyone else around me did, I stopped shaking hands. Whenever I met someone, I kept my distance. I started carrying alcohol hand sanitizer with me everywhere. I cleaned my hands constantly. People laughed. Some thought I was being rude. Others joked that I had become a germaphobe. At work, I continued warning my boss and coworkers. I told anyone willing to listen that they should start thinking about what would happen if the outbreak reached Britain. Almost nobody took me seriously. I also prepared at home. Nothing extreme. I didn't empty supermarket shelves or fill my garage with supplies. I simply bought enough food to comfortably last about 2 weeks. To me, it seemed like common sense. To everyone else, it looked like paranoia. My family eventually became so worried about my behavior that they sat me down for what was essentially an intervention. They told me I needed to stop. They said I was frightening people. They insisted I was behaving like a madman. They assured me everything would be fine. I remember leaving that conversation feeling completely defeated. For the first time, I genuinely wondered if I had become obsessed. Maybe I had spent too much time researching. Maybe I'd convinced myself something terrible was coming when it really wasn't. Maybe everyone else was right. Then, about a week later, everything changed. The headlines exploded. News channels switched to constant coverage. Governments began announcing emergency measures. Businesses started closing. Travel restrictions appeared. People rushed to supermarkets. Shelves emptied. Masks suddenly became impossible to find. Almost overnight, the things I'd spent months warning people about became reality. The strangest part wasn't feeling satisfied. There was no satisfaction. Watching the world shut down wasn't something anyone could celebrate. Instead, I mostly felt numb. Everything I'd been trying to explain was now happening in real time. The world changed so quickly that it almost didn't feel real. One evening, shortly after lockdown began, I decided to leave the house for a short walk. Not because I needed anything. I simply wanted to stretch my legs after being indoors for days. It was late. The streets were almost completely empty. The silence was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Normally, there would be traffic, people walking, shops open. Instead, there was almost nothing. As I walked toward the local petrol station, I suddenly stopped. Standing in the middle of the road was a herd of deer, not one or two, a whole group. They stood there calmly, completely undisturbed. The roads that had once belonged to cars suddenly belonged to wildlife. It was one of the most surreal sights I've ever witnessed. As I stood there watching them, a strange realization hit me. Everything I had spent months worrying about had actually happened. Those fears that had made people question my sanity hadn't been imaginary. They had become reality. That moment changed something inside me. For most of my life, I'd quietly believed I wasn't as intelligent as the people around me. I assumed other people knew better. I doubted my own judgment. I often dismissed my own instincts before anyone else had the chance to. That experience forced me to reconsider those beliefs, not because I thought I was some kind of genius. Far from it. I simply realized that sometimes paying close attention, asking questions, and trusting evidence matters more than following popular opinion. Over the following months, a few people apologized. Some coworkers admitted they should have listened. A couple of friends quietly acknowledged that I had seen the warning signs long before they had. Several family members admitted they had underestimated the situation. Those conversations meant a great deal to me. But not everyone apologized. Some people never mentioned it again. Some acted as though those earlier conversations had never happened. Others simply couldn't bring themselves to admit they had been wrong. I've come to understand that it's difficult for many people to acknowledge when they completely misjudge a situation. Looking back, I don't think about those months because I happen to recognize the danger early. I think about them because they completely changed how I see myself. For the first time in my life, I stopped assuming my judgment was automatically worth less than everyone else's. I learned that sometimes being the only person in the room who believes something doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong. Sometimes it simply means you've noticed something everyone else hasn't yet. It's a lesson I'll never forget, and one that has stayed with me long after the masks disappeared, the lockdowns ended, and the world slowly began returning to normal. I lived in my childhood home for almost 20 years before finally moving out. It was the only home I had ever really known, and because I had spent nearly my entire life there, I became familiar with every little detail about it. Like most older houses, it had its own personality. When the wind picked up, the walls would creak. The wooden floors sometimes groaned when the temperature changed. The pipes made strange knocking sounds every now and then, especially during the winter. Doors would occasionally settle in their frames, and the roof always seemed to make a few noises during storms. None of that ever bothered me. When you grow up in the same house, those sounds become normal. After a while, you don't even notice them anymore. They simply become part of everyday life. Because of that, I always considered myself a pretty rational person. If someone told me they heard strange noises in an old house, I would probably tell them it was just the building settling or the wind moving through the walls. That's exactly what I believed. Until 2 nights changed the way I looked at that house forever. The first incident happened while I was still living with my parents. It was a completely ordinary evening. Everyone had gone to bed hours earlier, but I had stayed up later than everyone else. I wasn't doing anything special. I was just watching television and wasting time before finally deciding I should probably get some sleep myself. Eventually, I started feeling hungry. I remember walking downstairs toward the kitchen to grab something to eat before going to bed. The house was completely quiet. No television, no music, no voices. Just the usual peaceful silence that settles over a home after everyone has fallen asleep. As I walked through the downstairs hallway toward the kitchen, I suddenly heard something. At first, I couldn't quite figure out what it was. The sound was soft, very soft, almost distant. I stopped walking and listened more carefully. There it was again. It sounded like someone crying, not loud sobbing, not screaming, just quiet, muffled crying. The sound seemed to be coming from the second-floor living room. Immediately, I assumed it was my mom. Maybe she couldn't sleep. Maybe she was upset about something. Maybe she had gotten up during the night and was watching television. Without really thinking about it, I called upstairs. "Mom, are you okay?" My voice echoed through the quiet house. There was no answer. I waited for several seconds. Nothing. The crying had stopped. Everything became completely silent again. I called out one more time. Still nothing. At that point, I started feeling a little confused. If it wasn't my mom, then who had I heard? Trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, I quietly walked upstairs and checked my parents' bedroom. The door was slightly open. Both of my parents were fast asleep, not pretending, not lying awake, actually asleep. My dad was snoring softly, and my mom hadn't moved at all. Neither of them looked like they had recently been awake. I stood there for a few moments, trying to understand what had just happened. Eventually, I shrugged it off. People hear strange things when they're tired. Maybe it had been the television from another house. Maybe the wind had carried a sound through an open window. Maybe I had simply imagined it. Whatever it was, I didn't think about it much after that. Life went on. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Eventually, years passed. Nothing strange ever happened again. The house continued making its usual creaks and groans, but I never heard that crying sound again. Over time, I became convinced that I'd simply imagined it. Then, years later, it happened again. My parents had gone away for a few days, leaving me home alone. I don't remember where they had gone. I only remember that I had spent the evening out and was returning home after dark. It was late. The neighborhood was quiet. Most of the houses had their lights off, and there wasn't another person anywhere on the street. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was dark, exactly as I expected. I had barely taken my first step into the hallway when I heard it. The same sound. The exact same muffled crying. The moment it reached my ears, something happened that I still can't explain. My entire body froze. Not because I consciously decided to stop moving. I simply couldn't move. It felt as though every muscle in my body locked at exactly the same moment. Before my mind even had time to think, I somehow knew exactly what I was hearing. It was the same cry. The identical sound I had heard years earlier. The strange part wasn't recognizing it. The strange part was how instantly my body recognized it. I hadn't thought about that night in years. Yet the second I heard the crying again, every memory came rushing back. My heart started racing. My stomach dropped. Every instinct I had told me something was wrong. The crying wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. If anything, it sounded almost sad. But hearing it again filled me with a fear that I can't properly describe. It wasn't ordinary fear. It felt deeper than that. Almost instinctive. As if some part of my brain was reacting before I even understood why. I stood perfectly still in the doorway. Listening, the sound lasted only a few seconds. Then, just like before, it stopped. The silence afterward somehow felt even worse. The house suddenly seemed different. Not because anything had changed, but because I knew I wasn't imagining the memory anymore. I had heard that exact sound twice, years apart. I stayed where I was for another minute, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to search the house. Another part wanted to turn around, get back in my car, and leave. Eventually, I forced myself to walk through the rooms one by one. I checked downstairs first. Nothing. Then I went upstairs. Every bedroom was empty. The second-floor living room was empty. Every window was closed. Every door was locked. There wasn't a single sign that anyone else had been inside the house. I searched everything. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself there had to be some logical explanation. Maybe the sound had come from outside. Maybe someone in the neighborhood had been crying, and the acoustics somehow carried it into the house. Maybe there was another explanation I simply hadn't thought of. But no matter how many possibilities I considered, one thing never made sense. My reaction. I've heard strange noises in plenty of houses over the years. I've heard pipes banging, animals outside, neighbors arguing, branches scraping against windows. None of those sounds ever made my entire body freeze before my mind had time to process what I was hearing. Only that cry did. That's the part that has stayed with me all these years. Not the mystery of where the sound came from. Not whether it had a supernatural explanation. Simply the way my body reacted. Almost like some part of me recognized danger before I consciously understood what was happening. I eventually moved out of that house. I've lived in several different homes since then. I've never heard that sound again. Not once. I've also never experienced that overwhelming feeling of recognition anywhere else. Looking back now, I still don't know what caused it. Maybe there really was an ordinary explanation. Maybe old houses create strange echoes. Maybe exhaustion caused me to misinterpret an ordinary sound. Maybe memory connected two completely unrelated events. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I lived in that house for nearly 20 years. In all that time, I heard that mysterious crying only twice. The two incidents happened years apart. Both occurred late at night. Both sounded exactly the same, and both left me standing completely frozen, unable to explain why a quiet, distant cry frightened me more than anything else I've ever heard. Even today, whenever I think back to that house, I don't remember the creaking floors or the rattling windows. I remember those two nights, the silence, the muffled crying, and the strange certainty that, for reasons I'll probably never understand, my body knew that sound long before my mind did.